expanded, and I have my code editor on the left, so we can see the changes that we make on our right sidebar. Now, let's head over to Components, Navigation, and create a new component called right sidebar.tsx. Run RAFCE right inside of it, and let's import it within our app root layout. We want to add it right here below the section, so we have the left sidebar on the left side, and we have the right sidebar right here at the right side of the section where we have our children, which is the primary part of our page. Once you do that, you won't be able to see it yet because the navbar is hiding it. So let's style it a bit by turning this div into a section. Within it, we'll render another div, and then within that div, we'll render an h3 that'll say top questions, because in the right sidebar, we want to show the top questions people are asking. Next, let's give it a class name equal to h3-bold and text-dark 200 underscore light 900. There's no dash before 200 right here, and we still cannot see those top questions. So let's style the section so we can actually see it by giving it a padding top of 36, and you can see now it dropped down. Let's also give it a custom scroll bar so we don't show that ugly scroll bar. We can give it a background light 900 underscore dark 200, a light dash border property, sticky, specifically positioning it to the right side 0 and top side 0, flex, h dash screen, so it takes the full height of the screen, w dash 350 pixels for the width to give it some space, flex dash col, gap of 6 in between the elements, overflow, y auto, same thing as in our left sidebar, with a border of L for left side, a padding of 6 to give it some breathing room, shadow of light 300, on dark mode, shadow dash none, and on max extra large devices, it'll be hidden. So this is for tablet devices because we don't actually have enough space to show it. So check this out. If I go here and I collapse, notice how as soon as we start losing space for the main content, we're going to actually collapse the right sidebar. So in this case, we're not only making this mobile responsive, we're making it fully tablet responsive as well. Now let's go below this h3 and create a div. We can expand our editor just a bit more. And this div will act as the container for our top questions. So let's give it a class name equal to margin top of 7 to divide it a bit from the top questions header, flex, w dash full, flex dash col, and gap of 30 pixels in between the elements. Within it, we want to actually map over some of the hot questions that we have. So let's quickly generate a few. I'll create a new object at the top, and I'll name it hot questions. You can name it top questions as well. And it's going to be a series of objects with an underscore ID property, which is going to be a string of 1, and a title. Like we can say maybe how to create a custom hook in React. There we go. That's something that GitHub Copilot was wondering. And you can repeat this. Like, again, you can see how nicely it's offering me these auto-completions. How to use React Query, how to use Redux, how to use React Router. And let's add one more. That's going to be something like how to use React Context. Okay, it's all React related for Copilot. So now that we have these hot questions, we can actually map over them within this div by saying hot questions dot map, and for each one of these questions, we can automatically return a link because each one of these questions will actually be clickable and it'll point to the details page of that question. So let's say href is equal to /question question dot underscore ID. And in this case, we can also just destructure this ID as well as the title from the question, so we don't have to repeat ourselves. So now what you can do is just say question /underscore ID. But Adrian, didn't you tell me that we're going to use the routes constants like these ones right here? And if we're going to use them, how are we going to actually use them with a dynamic route like this? that accepts an ID? Well, check this out. We can go over to routes and create a new route for the profile. Since a profile is a dynamic route and is dynamic based on the parameter of ID, which is of a type string, we can now dynamically form a /profile /ID string like this. So this way, we still get all the type checking and error handling, but we cannot make a mistake like this one. Let me show you how we use it. You just say routes dot profile, and you pass in what you have to pass. In this case, an underscore ID. Pretty cool, right? Let's also give this link a key equal to underscore ID, and let's give it a class name equal to flex cursor dash pointer items dash center justify dash between and a gap of 7. And within it, we can render a p tag. That'll render the title. So now you should be able to see 4 or 5 different titles. We can also give it a class name of body-medium, text-dark 500, and light 700. Okay, and finally, right after it, we can render an image coming from next image with a source equal to /icons /chevron -right .svg with an alt tag equal to chevron with a width of 20, height of 20, and a class name of invert-colors. If you do that, now they're going to appear clickable. So you can just navigate over to that top question if you want to learn more about it. If you check out the design, you can notice that we can even spice it up a bit. So we have some of these exchanging red and blue circles, which also looks great. But more importantly, below those questions, we have popular tags. And before we go ahead and implement those tags, first, we need to create a tag card, which is this one right here, like a chip component. So to create it, let's create a new component. I'll create it within components, new folder called cards, and within cards, I'll create a new tag card.tsx. Run rafce inside of there. And to create it, we'll be using ShadCN's badge component. So we can run mpx ShadCN add latest, add badge. Let me show you how it works. First things first, the tag needs to have some info inside of it, like an ID, name, question, and so on. So let's think about different properties that each tag needs to have. It has to have its ID and the name, based off of which we'll generate the icon. That's also a pretty cool thing that I want to teach you, how to dynamically generate icons based on text. Next, we can have the questions part, which is going to be a number of questions related to that tag, and then another Boolean that's going to allow us to choose whether we want to display the number of questions or not, because here we can show different tags, but we're not going to show the list of questions near them. And also, we can have different versions of cards like a compact card or a larger card. So let's actually accept all of these props by saying underscore ID, name, number of questions, show count, and whether it's compact or not. That's going to be of a type props. We can define those props right here by saying interface props, where we have an ID of a type string, a name of a type string, a list of questions of a type number, a show count, which is going to be a Boolean, but it'll be optional, and compact, which will be optional and a Boolean. So now that we know which props does this tag card accept, we can go back to our right sidebar and actually map over some of the imaginary cards that we have. So let's create them right here at the top below our hot questions. I'll say const popular tags is equal to an array where each one is an object with an ID, name, and the number of questions. And in this case, the name can be lowercase. We can also repeat this a couple more times, like ID JavaScript, TypeScript, Next.js, React Query, whatever it is, with different numbers of questions. Feel free to put your own technologies right here. Once we have a list of popular tags, we can actually map over the tag cards. So let's go below this link and below 2 more divs, and I'll create another div right here with a class name equal to margin top of 16 to divide it a bit from the top. I'll give it an h3, which is going to say popular tags. Going back to our page, this is how it looks like. Let's give it a class name equal to h3-bold and text-dark 200, light 900. There we go. That's better. And right within it, let's create a div with a class name equal to margin top of 7, flex, flex-call, and a gap of 4. And within it, we can map over the popular tags, extract the ID name and the question, and for each one of these cards, we can return a tag card, which we have created in our cards. And to it, we can pass a key equal to _ID. We can pass the _ID itself equal to _ID. We can pass the name equal to name. We can pass questions equal to questions. We can pass show count in this case because we do want to show it, and compact. So now you can see 5 different tag cards appear right here. Now it's our job to go into the tag card and actually make it look like a card and show that technology icon dynamically. To do that, I'll turn this into a link because yes, our tags will also be different links pointing to a special tag details page where you can see all of the different questions with that tag. This is quite a big app. So as you can imagine, everything will be clickable. Going to the question details, tag details, profile details, everything will be there as in every enterprise application. So each link will have an href pointing to /tags / and then _ID. And you know the drill. We're going to turn this into an actual route constant. So let's copy it, head over to routes, and we can create one pointing to tags, which is going to be a function that's going to point to tags ID. So now we can say routes dot tags, call it as a function, and pass the _ID. To this link, I'll also provide a class name of flex, justify between, and a gap of 2. And I can try to render a name right within it. And now we can see different tags appear right here. Don't try to click the question details or the tag details because we haven't yet created the routes for those. Instead of just rendering a name, I'll actually render a ShatCN badge component. Within the badge, I'll render a div with a class name equal to flex-center and space-x-2. Within it, I'll render I for italic. And within here, we want to render the technology icon. Right below it, we can render a span, inside of which we can render a name. There we go. That's looking nice. Let's also style the badge itself by giving it a class name equal to subtle-medium, background-light 800, dark 300, text-light 400, light 500, rounded-MD for the corners, border-none, padding X of 4, padding Y of 2, and uppercase. There we go. So now this is looking much more like an icon. I even think we can make them a bit larger by removing this subtle medium. There we go. But then it's not the same as the questions, so I think I'm going to keep it. Finally, below the badge, if show count is true, in that case, we want to render a p tag that's going to render the number of questions. And we can style it a bit by giving it a class name of small medium, text-dark 500, light 700. And we can fix this class name. And now this is looking great. The number of questions related to that tag. But now the main question is, how are we going to generate a dynamic icon for each one of the technologies that the user enters? Keep in mind that they can type in their own tags. So we need to try to make it work for most of them. But if it doesn't work, we can show some kind of a default option. To make this work, we'll use devicon or dev icon that allows us to search for, what is this, 2,500 different icons from JavaScript to React, maybe even Redux. Yep, whatever you search for, it should be here. So how does it work? Well, we have to place this into our header of our HTML file. So let's copy it. Then head over to layout. This will be our primary layout because we want to show them everywhere. And then where we have the HTML, we can add the head right here. So if you ever need to add some links or scripts manually, then you can do it within the layout here. And you can paste the link that we just copied. This will give us access to all of those icons. Now, to keep the logic of generating the icons separated from this file, we can create a new utility function by going to lib utils. And then here we can say export const get dev icon class name. And it's going to accept the tech name that we pass in of a type string. Next, we need to fix up that name a bit. We can say const normalized tech name is equal to tech name dot replace, and we want to replace all the empty spaces or dots or stuff like that, so we can use a regular expression to globally remove all the dots and spaces. And we can also run to lowercase it. What do we want to replace those dots and empty spaces with? Well, it's going to be just an empty string. So that's going to look like this. Now, what we can do is define some kind of a tech map that's going to look like this, which is basically going to be just an object where we can say that JavaScript is going to correspond to devicon JavaScript plain. Same thing for example, JS. It's going to correspond to the same devicon JavaScript plain. And we can even say, maybe not plain, maybe we can go for the color. So we can say colored like this. Let's give that a shot just to see how it looks like. I'll add colored for this one, and the other one can remain uncolored. Now that we have this tech map, we can try to map over the tech name to the name of this icon. So we can say return tech map, and in the tech map, we search for normalized tech name, and actually we can make each one colored right here. We don't necessarily have to say colored here. And if we cannot find an icon, we can say devicon or dev icon. One more time, dev icon, plain. So then we'll show some kind of a default icon. And let's actually fix this right here. I think I have an extra ending string right here. There we go. And this tech is going to complain a bit, saying that it doesn't know that we have access to whatever we're searching for. So we have to fix the type for these icons by saying that this will be of a type key of a type string, and then the value will be of a type string as well. So now it's not going to complain. So how exactly does this work? Well, now we can try to call this utility function, get dev icon class name. We can call it right here where we have the icon by giving this element a class name, and to it, we'll need to fetch the dev icon class name right here by saying const icon class is equal to get dev icon class name, to which we can pass the name we're searching for, and make sure to import this from libutils. Once you do that, in the class name, we can pass this icon class, and we can also just make it a bit smaller. So we can say text-sm. If you do this, you can see that now for JavaScript, we actually have a real icon. But for other icons, we still cannot really see anything here. So let's go back to our utils, and we can further improve our tech map. I'm pretty sure that just Copilot could fill this out for me, which is pretty cool. You can see that it knows and it can anticipate different people's desires like React, TypeScript, and so on. But what I've done is I've took some time and I've actually mapped out a few more most commonly used icons. I'll paste those in the lesson below. You can just copy them and that should be good for now. HTML, CSS, Git, PHP, C#, C++, Deno, Bun, Node.js, Next.js, React, and so on. And the last one, React Query, doesn't have any icon. Or wait, maybe it does in the light mode? No, never mind, it doesn't. So let's try to debug this. What we're saying here is if you find the one in the tech map, then return it colored. But I don't think this is a proper ternary. Actually, what we should be doing is check right here before. If tech map normalized tech name exists, then return this, else return this. And now you can see a default one appearing for React Query because it couldn't find it in the database. This is great. And this is the type of situation that ChatGPT is perfect for, or even Copilot. Let me show you what I mean. If we go to dev icon, there should be a list of all the icons somewhere. And even if there's not, you can see that you can scroll through all of them. So if you just press Command A or Control A, you can copy all of them. Then you can paste all of these into ChatGPT and tell it to generate a structure looking like this for all of the icons. So let me actually try that. I'll create a new constants file and I'll call it techmap.ts. I'll actually move over this techmap from here, just so we don't need to keep it here. There we go, techmap. And I will nicely export it right at the top, export const techmap. And then in the utils right here, we can import it from constants. Everything should still work normally. But now I'll use Copilot, or you can use ChatGPT, as I've told you. Select this entire part, press Command or Control Shift I to open up the Ask Copilot dialog, and to it, I'll pass the entire list of icons that I copied from dev icon that looks something like this. Now I'll say something like, generate a tech map like the one in this file, but make it contain all of the icons from dev icon. Let's see if it'll do it. You can see I just passed plain text that I copied from the website. Now it's collecting a lot of info, filtering it, and returning it. And check this out, containing all icons from dev icon version 2.16, like this. Isn't that pretty cool, right? And it's gonna take some time to generate, as it's just in the letter C, so I'll pause this video and I'll be right back. Okay, it's still going. Maybe I should have used ChatGPT. It would have been just a bit faster. But okay, let's give it some more time. There we go. It tried to generate as much as possible, but it looks like we've hit a limit. Doesn't matter. I'll take what we have so far. So I'll just go ahead and copy this and replace our current map with that. So let me just select it and I'll paste it. And now I'll end it right here. I think that should be more than enough. We have about 600 lines worth of this. We also have one warning right here. It looks like it made a mistake right here, so I'll remove this. And it looks like at one point it actually just started duplicating all of the values. So I'll remove the second half. Yep, this wasn't that successful because it looks like it didn't get React, TypeScript, and all the other ones. So in this case, I actually want to give it a shot with ChatGPT. I'll take the same prompt that I gave to Copilot, like this one right here. Hopefully I can copy it. Yep, I'll go right here and I'll copy the whole thing. There we go. And I'll paste that thing alongside our previous implementation of the tech map right here to ChatGPT. Let's see what it comes up with. Okay, so it actually provided some different variations. Return a tech map of all the icons. Sometimes it can be a hit or miss, but let's see what it comes up with. It looks like it's following a nice structure and generating exactly the icons that we need. And it even started with the most common web development ones. MongoDB, Git, CSS, HTML. It even included PHP there. There we go. So includes a wide range of popular web and software development tools. We can copy it. We can paste it here. We have about 200 original ones. So now you can see that most are covered, which is exactly what we need. And it should also work with all of the other user inputted ones, at least if they're popular technologies. I just wanted to take some time to show you how sometimes using ChatGPT or Copilot can be useful, although it can also be a hit or miss. So with that in mind, great job on implementing the right sidebar. It looks great on desktop devices. It is even collapsible, so it gets hidden once we lose some space. And it'll be super cool once we implement the question details and tag details pages so we can actually visit them. When it comes to the code, we have added quite a few files. We have modified the layout. We have implemented the sidebar, the reusable tag card, the badge. I showed you how to use dynamic routes, and we learned a bit of how we can generate this map that would allow us to match most user-generated tags. So let's say implement right sidebar, commit, and push. Great work. From this part of the course onwards, we'll focus on complex UI that shares common data across different pages. And for that reason, we seriously need to think about how to approach state management within our applications. So I prepared this quick lesson that I want to go over with you. Let's go through it together. One of the frequently misinterpreted ideas in front-end or library framework usage, whether it's React or Next.js, is our tendency to use flashy trends over selecting what truly suits the situation or case at hand. You know, before you read this, you probably thought about which state management library to use, like RTK for Redux, or nowadays much more popular Zustand. It's normal. Like, we like to show off in a good way, and we like to use the tech that other people and YouTubers talk about. That's totally okay. But let's think a bit about the why. Question everything you're doing and only settle for the best. It's that why that plays a huge role in your developer life. Regarding how, even ChatGPT can do that nowadays. But let's explain the why properly. So try to answer this why. Which state management library would you like to use for Devflow? And if you got what I said earlier, the first thing you should ask yourself is, do we really need a state management library in the first place? Well, the best way to do that is by looking at the actual application flow on Figma. Here, we can ask ourselves, what kind of data are we working with? That's the first question. Are we working with questions where we're mapping over them and each question has the creator, the timestamp, the number of votes, answers, views, and so on? Are we working with the data of displaying these navigation bar links? Maybe information about the user? What about the top questions or popular tags? How does that data change across different pages? Like on the other page, we keep the left sidebar, the right sidebar, and the navbar, but the middle content changes to show more details about a specific question. You can go through a couple of these questions and try to figure out which pieces of data we're handling. The second question, which I kinda answered already, you can see that that's how I naturally went through the design, is what kind of data is being repeated on different pages. So what would you say? In this case, what is being repeated? Well, we could say that left sidebar and right sidebar are being repeated, which is true, but we have already extracted those into separate reusable components. We also have pages like the users and tags and jobs, but these are not really getting repeated, are they? And finally, is there any particular kind of data that's being used across the application? And in this case, your initial response might involve the user. As you can see, the user data, which we can see right here at the top right, is being used in every single one of these pages. Everywhere there's this little JSM logo, or your logo in this case. So that means that storing that piece of data, the user session, in the global state would allow us to reuse it and save us from another database call. Maybe some search and filtering information should be in global state as well, like I mentioned for the sidebars. And that's a totally valid point. But now we have to explore things in detail and really answer the why. Behind the question, why do we need state management in the first place? And if we do need it, what's the simplest and best way to implement it? Now that you've reached that paradigm shift where you've been first asking yourself whether you need to implement state management in the first place, let's discuss some different types of state management. In simple words, state management is like keeping track of everything happening in your application. A very good example of that is playing a video game, where you need to remember your score, your level, the items you collected. It's like having the entire inventory list to track all of this information so you can play smoothly. Primarily, it's about organizing and updating the data so your app knows what's happening and can react accordingly. We have two different types of state management, local and global. When talking about the local state management, this means managing data within a single component or module of an application. This means that the component is not directly accessible by other parts of the application unless we explicitly pass down the props of that component. For example, everyone's favorite counter example, where we have a single counter component that manages its own state. Yep, a single useState hook still counts as state management. Doesn't have to be Redux or Zustand or something more complex. Technically, we're talking about local state management here, as this component is encapsulating this state with a setter function, and at the end of the day, it ends up using it. On the other hand, there's the global state management, which involves managing data that needs to be accessed and modified by multiple components across the entire application. This global state is typically stored in a centralized location, such as a global store or context, where it can be accessed and modified by any component that needs it without the need for prop drilling or passing data through multiple layers of components. An example of that would be good old Context API, where we have a counter provider, we create a new React context, we manage the state there, and then we pass it over to the counter context, which then allows every other component in our application to access it. How do we access it? Well, we wrap those components with a counter provider, and we can use the counter component. In the same way, it can be used anywhere, just by using the useCounter hook. But using the Context API isn't the only solution in React. There are many options, like Redux, which is very complex, Zustand, which aims for simplicity, Context API, Recoil, and even MobX. But it's important to understand that there isn't a single best library among the others. Each one offers a unique approach to state management and addresses different problems effectively. So rather than debating with other developers on Twitter, consider your specific problem and architect the solution by using the library that works best for you. So to summarize, we have local state management and global state management and different libraries that allow us to handle it. Now, we discussed many of the libraries in the last lesson, but which one will we actually use in our Next.js applications? By now, you know that Next.js, and specifically Next.js 15, is a bit different, and it allows us to approach state management in a completely new way. So here's the thing. Using those libraries or methods we discussed in the previous lesson in Next.js would turn your page or anything into a client-side component, and that goes against what Next.js is all about and its server-side features. Transitioning everything to the client side in Next.js would essentially equate to using plain old React. Since Redux, Context API, Zustand, and others are all hook-based patterns, we can't use them on the server side, at least not for now. So that's the issue. And why can't we use the hooks on the server side? Because they rely on component lifecycles, which is specific to the client-side rendering environment. You know that you cannot use useState, useEffect, or others. In the same way, you cannot use useContext. So what's the solution to this problem? Does it even exist? Or should we just stick to using these libraries whenever we want, without considering that we'll be turning everything into a client-side mess? What should we do? Well, you'll be pleased to know that the answer to that question is not new. It's an old school approach that most big companies have used, but it hasn't received the attention it deserves. It's pretty underrated, even though it's the fastest and the simplest. Do you have any idea what is it? And search for something. Well, try it out. Visit the Amazon website and search for anything that you like. Maybe that MacBook you've been waiting to buy for a long time. But while searching, keep an eye on the URL. If you've been paying attention, you'll see that whatever you typed in the search bar has also been reflected in the URL bar. But what does that mean? Well, first of all, one benefit of this is that if you share that URL with your friend, they should be able to see exactly the same results. And that, my friend, is URL state management. You won't see the same effect with other ways of state management. In React, if you manage the filters or the search through the client side, and you pass over the link, it's just not going to contain that data unless you somehow put it in the URL. Lots of websites, and not just Amazon, use URL state management to keep track of stuff. Even Supabase does it. For example, I wanted to check how many people bought the Ultimate Next.js course, so I clicked on a filter, and the web address changed that filter to show project, editor, and then filter course name. As you can see, it's completely legal, it works, and it's actually considered the best practice. By managing the state via the URL, you can easily share links, and when someone else opens that link, they'll see the same result as you did. And this also helps to improve the SEO. How, you might ask? Well, this is because all of the variations of your content, such as different filters, sorting options, or pagination, have their own URLs, making it easier for search engines to discover and rank your pages appropriately. In simple terms, imagine your website is like a big library. and each URL is like a unique bookshelf. When you organize your books or the content on different bookshelves or URLs, it's easier for people or search engines to find that specific book or content they're looking for. Not only does this improve your website's visibility and ranking, it's also the easiest way to manage content. So is that something new in Next.js? Well, not at all. You can do the same URL management in React, but Next.js just allowed us to realize how powerful it is because it helps us to render things on the server side. Before we dive deeper into understanding how to do URL state management in Next.js, let me teach you how you can get different parts of the URL information in Next.js. URL stands for Uniform Resource Locator, and its parameters typically consist of several components. First, we have the scheme. This is a protocol like HTTP or HTTPS. Domain is the domain name or IP address of the server, like jsmastery.pro. Port is optional, like localhost 3000. Then we have a path pointing to a specific resource, like /next15. We have the query parameters, also known as search params in Next.js, which allow you to pass over additional data to the server as part of the request, typically used for filtering and modifying the requested resource. They are appended after the URL with a question mark and separated by ampersands. For example, $param1 is equal to value 1 and param2 is equal to value 2. Finally, you can have a hash indicating some ID on the page. Now, how can you retrieve this URL information in different ways in Next.js? Well, if you're in the main page, then you can access the information through the page props, simply saying function page, where you have params and search params. So if the URL looks like this, books1234 page 2 filter equal to latest, you can get the ID from params, since the params will hold that ID value, and search params will hold the value of page and filter. And that is the key point. Right here, what we're doing is basically managing state. In this case, it is local state, but if you navigate to a different page with these things in the URL, what's going to happen? You're going to traverse that data over to the second page. So this can be both local and global state management. Finally, you can choose to pass those values to other components or use other options to access them. The best way is to do it through Next.js's hooks, such as use params and use search params, which give you the same thing, allow you to extract those values. For example, you can get access to the type if a URL contains the type. But with this approach, using hooks, it would mean that we're turning that component into a client component. So you only want to do this for forms or other components that are already client by default. So as a rule of thumb, if your component is near its parent page, then instead of opting for these hooks, you can pass params and search params of the page through props to its children components. A bit of prop drilling won't hurt. But if your component is far away from the page, then you should use the hooks that I mentioned. And now you know how to access information from the URL. But now, how are we actually going to update that information so that it is even there for us to fetch it? Approach of state management in Next.js, URL state management. But now let's talk a bit about how you can do it effectively. As I said, it's not related to Next.js. You can do it in React too, but preferring URL as the state management solution in Next.js will solve 90% of your problems and save you from making everything client-side. So how do we do it? Think about Amazon. When we typed something into a search bar or an input, hit enter, and the same thing appeared in the URL. Same thing for the filters. Click something, the checkbox ticks on the website, and it appears in the URL. Do you get it? So all we have to do is whenever a user types something or selects something, we have to add that or type it out in the URL. And there are many ways of doing it. The first one is through a Next.js link. Simple and straightforward. The link actually changes the URL, like the path name and even the query. By doing this, your URL will look like this: /jobs, type is equal to software developer. Whatever your query is, you specify it inside the href, and whenever someone clicks on it, it'll form the right URL with the right query. The second way is using a Next.js use router hook to do it within client pages. There, you can use router.push and do the same thing as before. Doing this will result in the same thing. But again, you're right, this will turn it into a client page, so be careful when you use it. Another way is to do it programmatically by using built-in JavaScript objects such as URL search params to create a new URL and navigate to it using useRouter or window location. A simple example is, again, creating your own search params, setting the query, and then re-navigating your browser to that location. I hope this isn't too much, but it can come super handy when we have to change the URL parameters frequently on any user action. For example, when doing a filter. And here is how that would look like in a real example. I have created a utility function called update search params, which takes in the type of the param to update and its value. First, we construct the URL params object. We set the specified search parameter, and then we append it to the URL that we have right now, just the path name. In the same way, once somebody unchecks that checkbox or deletes their search bar, we have to also focus on deleting it from the URL bar. That's it. And of course, whenever you have a lot of code that people often have to type, there's a library for that. So in this case, there's a query string library, which I like using, which simplifies things significantly. You can create a new utility function called form URL query, which takes in the current URL, and then you can update it with the key and the value. And finally, you can return the updated URL, which you can then call like this: const new URL is equal to form URL query with the following params, the key and the value. And then you finally push to it. Look, I know that this isn't simple, especially when I laid out so much information about state management in Next.js in a couple of these text-based lessons. But moving forward in this course, we'll actually do it all within our DevFlow project. So you'll be able to learn and practice exactly what we covered right here. Think of these lessons just as an introduction, but now that you have the general information and the why we're doing it, learning how to do it will be simple. Let's focus on the homepage. We finally get a chance to replace this welcome to the world of Next.js with the actual UI that will display on the homepage. So I'll put my editor to the side right here, and we are ready to dive into page right within the root, where we're console logging the session. For the time being, I will remove this console log of the session as we don't need it, and I'm ready to start creating the UI of the future homepage. I'll keep everything wrapped in a React fragment, but I will then create an additional section right here. Within this section, I'll render an H1. Yep, this one. But now I'll make it say all questions, so we can show different questions that people have been asking on the platform. Let's actually give it a text-dark 100 and underscore light 900. And let's style the section as well by giving it a class name of w-full flex-call reverse. And you might wonder, why flex call reverse? Well, this is because it'll allow us to display elements from bottom to top instead of from top to bottom. And then on small devices, we can make it flex-row because we'll have enough space to show everything in a single row anyway. We can also have a justify between, a gap of 4, and on small devices, items-center. Right below this H1, we can display a button. And this button will come from UI components, of course. And it can render a link coming from next link. This link will have an href pointing to routes coming from constants dot ask underscore question. So we can head over to constants routes and create a new route called ask underscore question, which will simply go to ask dash question. This is going to be a form to create different questions. Finally, within this link, let's render a piece of text that says ask a question. There we go. And let's style it a bit by giving this button a class name equal to primary-gradient, min-h-46 pixels, padding x of 4, padding y of 3, and text-light 900 with an exclamation mark at the start. Also, we can add as child because we are rendering the link as the button. So actually the link will be the button. Great. Now we can create another section right below this section and give it a class name equal to margin top of 11. And within, we can render a search bar. So for now, I'll just say local search, and later on, we'll convert this into an actual local search component. Below it, we'll have filters. So we can say home filter right here, which will also become another component later on. And finally, we want to map over different questions. So let's create a div. It's going to have a class name equal to margin top of 10, flex, w-full, flex-call, so they appear one below another, and a gap of 6. And within here, we can show different question cards, like question card 1, and we can duplicate this like 4 times. And believe it or not, this is the gist of the structure of the homepage. It's going to look like this. All questions title right here, same as on other pages, we need to display the title of each one of these pages. For the homepage, it is a place where you can find answers to all the most popular questions. On the right side, we have a direct creative action that allows you to create a question. Below that, we have a local search. So let me take a chance to show that to you on the design, since we have this beautiful design. This right here is going to become a local search. After that, we have the home filters, which allows you to sort or filter by newest, recommended, frequent, and unanswered, in case you want to be a good soul and answer some of the people in trouble. And after that, we have a list of different questions. So now that we have created the basic structure of the homepage, what do you say that we start from top to bottom and implement all of these components, starting with the local search? To create our local search, you first need to notice that it's used in a lot of different places. I mean, just check this out. It's used right here on the homepage. Then you can see it right here on the global search as well. After that, again, it still remains in the global search, but it's also going to appear on pages like all users, as well as tags, and hey, even jobs. So this is a perfect example of a component that has to be made completely reusable so that it can match any scenario we put it in. So to get started creating the local search bar component, let's head over to components, create a new folder, and I'll call it search. And within the search folder, create a new component called local search.tsx. Run rafce, and then let's import it right within our homepage. You already get the drill, right, of how we create a simple component, and then we immediately import it so we can see it. And then once we do see it, we can dive right into it and start implementing it. So let's develop the UI first. And let me give you a quick real-world example of how this might look like in your workplace. You might start developing the functionality first and then not care about the UI at all. For example, focusing on searching on search queries, database calls, and so on, and then just have a basic HTML5 input that does the action. Or what you might do is first focus on the UI and then later on hook it up with the functionality. Both of these options are totally okay. And what we'll be doing in this case is a mix of two. As you have noticed, for sign in and sign up pages, we did do the UI, but then we actually hooked it up with OAuth. But then we actually hooked it up with NextAuth and GitHub and Google providers. We didn't yet do the form, and that's for a reason. We first want to have a bit of a UI on the homepage, and then we'll dive into the functionality of allowing us to ask a question, filter through those questions, and so much more. But I prefer to have the UI. That would allow us to do that, because then we can visually see what's happening. So starting off with the local search component. So starting off with this local search, let's first create a div. And this div will have a class name equal to background dash light 800 underscore dark gradient. I don't think we've had this one before. We can also give it a property of flex, min dash h dash 56 pixels, grow items dash center, gap of 4, rounded dash 10 pixels, and a padding X of 4 to give it some breathing room on left and right. If I save this, we have something that resembles the search. Right below that, we can render an input. And this input is of course going to come from UI input. And we can pass a type equal to text to it with a placeholder equal to, let's do search for now. We also need to pass the value of this input, which is going to be just the default search value for now. We also need to pass it an onChange, which is going to be a callback function where we get the event, and then we set the value of the search to that event. But we don't yet have the handler, right? So are we going to define the handler here, like a function that handles that search? Or are we going to define it somewhere else? We have to be very careful with thinking of how we approach it. For now, I'll just leave this onChange as a blank function, like this, so we can decide what we want to do with it later on. And of course, since we're using an input here, we'll have to turn this into a useClient component. So right at the top, we can say useClient. Okay, good. Let's also style this input by giving it a class name of paragraph-regular, no focus to remove that ugly outline that we typically see, placeholder, text-dark 400, underscore light 700, border dash none. There we go, that's much better. Shadow dash none, and outline dash none. All of these are going to play a role into making it a bit more natural. And for now, we can leave the search value actually empty because we have no way of modifying it. And if we go back to the design, and specifically if we focus on the home page, which is right here, you can see that we have an icon on the left side, search for questions here. So let's go ahead and add that icon. We can do that before the input by rendering an image coming from next image. It's going to have a source equal to, let's do /icons/search.svg. Then we must also give it a width of about 24, a height of 24, an alt tag of search, and we can give it a class name of cursor-pointer. If we save this, you can now see this great magnifying glass. Great. But now the question is, how are we going to make this reusable so we can use it across different places and modify its value across different pages? Well, for that, we can pass different props to it. And once again, this is a recurring theme. Whenever you want to have a component that changes what it does depending on where it's shown, well, that's the only thing that makes sense, right? Here, you're rendering it within a specific context. In this case, it's being rendered within the context of the home page. So it needs to have additional information on what it has to do. For that reason, let's actually pass it some props. The first thing that I'll pass it is going to be an img src, an image source for the icon. So we can say /icons/search.svg. Next, we can pass it a placeholder equal to search questions ... because sometimes we might want to search tags or users or something else. And then depending on the context where it's being shown, you can also pass it some other classes, like additional classes that you want to render only for this specific variant of the local search. In this case, I'll give it flex1 so it can extend if it needs to. Also, this search is going to be one of the primary things that'll be handling the state management of our application. It'll have to update the URL to modify the search query. So it has to know where it is. So for that reason, I'll give it a route. In this case, it is on the home page, so I'll give it a route of just /. Now, if I go into the local search, I can accept all of those props. So let's destructure the route, the img source, the placeholder, and the other classes. And we can specify the types of these by saying props, and then we can define the interface of props right here above, where the route will be a string, image source will be a string, placeholder will be a string, other classes will be optional and also of a type string. So now we can add these additional classes right here by rendering this as a template string. There we go. And we can just add other classes if need be. Also, we can modify the placeholder So right here, we can render the placeholder. And let's not forget about the image source right here. So we can say img source, so we can render different kinds of icons right here. But now the biggest question is, how are we going to deal with the value and the on change of this search and actually make it affect the page we're currently viewing and its contents? Well, let me show you. Right here at the top of the local search, we can say const search params and make that equal to use search params coming from next navigation. We can actually use the use search params because we are in a client component, so hooks are allowed here. Next, we're gonna get the query from the search params by saying const query is equal to search params.get query. And if a query doesn't exist, we can set it to an empty string. Now that we have the query, we can create a new use state field that I'll call search and set search, which at the start will be set to a query. So if a query is nothing, it'll be an empty string, but if a query exists, it'll just populate it. Now we can use this search right here as the value of the input. So we can say search, and now that I look at it, search is also a verb. So it might be a bit better to call it a search query and set search query. Great. We can modify the value, and on change, we can get the event and then say set search query to set it with e.target.value. So now we can actually type into it, but we cannot yet submit it, right? If you type something or click something, it's not modifying the URL, it's not doing anything. Before I teach you how we'll submit it, first I want to show you that it actually works. You can actually test it out by manually modifying the URL query by saying question mark query is equal to, and then you can type any kind of search term right here. Like let's say really hard React.js question. And if you press enter, you'll notice that it gets populated right here based on the URL query. This is great. But now we'll have to do the real deal. We'll have to implement the URL state management. Remember the URL state management module? Well, now is your chance to put things to practice. To make our life a bit easier, we'll be using a query string library. It is a super simple and very light library that just makes it easier to work with URL queries. Like if you say location.search is going to give you the search query params part. Or if you parse it, you're going to get a nice object out of it. Could you do all of this by using manual JavaScript? Sure you could, but it's a bit easier like this. You get .parse, .stringify, and a couple of other useful methods. So let's install it by heading over to our terminal and running npm install query-string. Since we'll be using this query string library in a couple of different places, I want to put its code over to libutils. Or let's even create a new utility file just for what it will do. So we can call it url.ts. Inside of here, we'll create two functions. Const form URL query is going to be equal to just a regular arrow function. And another one will be const remove keys from query. And I think we talked a bit about this at the end of the URL state management module. The form URL query function will update URL query parameters with a new value. So you want to pass a key and a value to it, and it's just going to add it to the URL. That's it. It doesn't do anything else. So right here as params, we'll accept a single object where we get the params, a key, and the value. And we get the params because we want to know the existing params that it has so we can append the new key and value to it. So let's get access to the current URL by saying const current URL is equal to qs as in query string, and we actually have to import this. So let's say import qs from query string like this. I'm going to zoom it in a bit so you can see better. Next, we'll say qs.parse, and we're going to pass the params, not parse URL, just parse in this case. And it might actually be a good idea to know what we're parsing, right? So for that reason, I'll first show you how we can call this function. So let's go ahead and export both of these functions. And now we can use them within our local search. I'll create a new use effect right here. And this use effect will run whenever the search changes. So let's add a dependency array and add the search query right within it. So whenever we change the search query, this function will be recalled. What do we want to do then? Well, we want to check if a search query exists. So if search query, in that case, we want to form a new URL containing that new search query. So we can say const new URL is equal to form URL query coming from lib URL. And now we know what it accepts. It accepts the existing params. So let's pass it the params. And those are going to be equal to search params dot to string. Nothing special yet, right? We're grabbing the search params, we're stringifying them, and passing them to form URL query. But before that, let me actually show you how the search params.string looks like. Let's actually render it right here as a piece of text within our input. So I'll just render search params.toString. And yes, this is how it looks like. Query is equal to really hard React.js question, which is our search term. So that's it. That's the only thing we're passing into the form URL query. What the parse functionality from query string will do is it'll actually parse it into an object. So the response of this will be an object where we have a query equal to really hard React.js question. That makes sense, right? We also want to pass in a key and a value. So let's say a key is equal to query and a value is going to be equal to the search query. We have the params to be able to notice what the current query is, because maybe some filters were already there. So it wouldn't just say query is equal to something. It would say filter is equal to new or filter is equal to upcoming. So we must not lose the other params. That's why we want to first stringify them and pass them over. And then we want to specify which new one we want to add and which new value we want to add. And also, even if we don't have any other inputs, we still need to specify the current state of the query input. Like as you're typing, the query will first be equal to R, and then RE, and then REA, and then the word really. So we first need to contain all of those values and then update it. So how do we update the value using this utility function? We'll say current URL, which is an object, and then we'll add a key within it equal to the value. Once we have it, we want to return a query string dot stringify URL, to which we can pass additional options of URL is equal to window.location.pathname, and then we want to append this query, which is the current URL. And I guess a better name for this would be a query string. So we're simply taking the base URL, taking the current query string, updating it with a new key and value, which we're appending to the query string, and then simply appending it onto the URL and forming a new URL. Let's also define the type of these props as URL query params, and that's going to be an interface, URL query params, where we're going to have a params of string, a key of string, and then a value of a string. Great. So now we know that we're passing these new values. And what are we going to do with this new URL? Well, we'll simply define a new router at the top by saying const router is equal to use router coming from next router. And then we'll use that router to push by saying router.push to the new URL. And we're going to set the scroll to be equal to false, because in some cases we don't need to scroll to the top. And this use router is coming from next navigation and not from next router. This is a very common mistake that happens, and you might experience some issues because some code editors or IDEs tend to use the next router functionality, but instead it should be coming from next navigation. And if you do that, that's good. Now you can see that we have a squiggly line right here complaining that this use effect wants some additional dependencies, such as the router. We can also pass a route. So if we change the route from home to tags, we want to be able to reload this function. And we can also pass the search params. So whenever any of these functionalities change, we want to be able to recall the use effect. If you reload, the error should be gone. And now we can focus on the case where we don't have a search query. So let's add an else to this if, meaning if we completely emptied it out, if we cleared out whatever is in the input. We do want to check though if path name is equal to the route we're currently on. So the path name is the current URL, and the route is the route that we're passing right here from the home page or from any other page. So we first want to make sure that they match. For that reason, I'll say const path name is equal to use path name coming from next navigation. And we can also add the path name right here to the dependency array. Now, if that is true, and if we don't have anything in the input, we still want to be able to form a new URL, but this time we want to remove the keys from the query instead of add them because our input is completely empty. So for that reason, let's create this remove keys from query function. And to do it, I will actually just duplicate this function as it's fairly similar. I'll rename it to remove keys from query, or we can say URL query. We get the query string, and this time we need to pass into the function the keys that we want to remove. So same as before, we call it remove keys from URL query. We pass in the existing params, which is equal to search params.toString, and then we pass in the keys to remove. And in this case, we simply want to remove a query because we cleared up our input. So now we get only the params and the keys to remove, which means that we have to create a new interface for this one, not the URL query params, but rather remove URL query params, which I will define right here at the top by duplicating this one, changing its name to remove URL query params, and instead of key and value, we get keys to remove, which is an array of strings. Now we can actually map over that array by saying keys to remove dot for each key. We want to perform an action, and that action will simply be delete query string key. Okay, pretty simple. So we're deleting it. After that, we form a new stringified URL to which we pass the URL and the query. So we need to add an additional options object that's going to be skip null is equal to true. Sometimes I notice that if we remove a filter and if instead of setting it to an empty string, it gets set to null, then we would end up having something like filter is equal to null in the URL. But if you run this, it'll actually clear it. So now let's go back to local search. And what are we going to do once we delete the keys from the URL? Can you guess? Well, we'll simply return it by saying router.push new URL scroll false. Great. Now let's try it out together. First, I will remove this search params2string because we no longer need it in the input. Next, we can see that this is our search and we can try typing something or even removing things. But this time we want to track how our URL bar behaves. That's the thing that we've been working on, right? So if you type something like React or just R for that matter, notice how immediately the question mark query appears and it is equal to R at the top. So if I continue typing React, you can see how a query gets updated. This is great. And since we're using this query string package, it automatically serializes it to be URL safe. So if I add a space, that's equal to the %20 character, or like arrows or something. You can see it all very nicely works. And the beauty of that is that if you type something, and you can now copy this URL and share it with your friend in the other browser, and the search will actually get populated for them. But not only the search doesn't matter, right? What matters is that this search will actually be applied to the fetch request of the database, which fetches all of the questions or the data. So that means that your friend or whoever you're sending this website to will have access to all the same data, cards, or content that you want them to have. So great, we have just implemented URL state management. But of course, to really call it state management, we actually need to do something with that data. For now, we're just modifying it. But before we go ahead and put it to use, I'm still not done with optimizing it. Can you spot the issue with this? Like whenever I type, right now nothing is happening, but imagine that we are doing a refetch to our database. And I type and type, and I delete, and I type, and I delete, and I type again. What's happening? We're making additional requests to the database. We're overwhelming it. We are just racking up bills and expenses for whoever is hosting that database. So to fix that, good developers use a tactic called debounce, or specifically a delay debounce, which allows you to only send a search that allows you to only send a request when a user stops typing for some time. How can we implement it? Well, it's pretty straightforward. We're going to use the built-in JavaScript functionalities. I will create a new function called const delay debounce fn, as in function, and I will use the set timeout functionality from JavaScript, which allows you to create a new function block. What set timeout does is it schedules execution of a one-time callback after a delay in milliseconds. So the first thing that you pass is the actual function, the callback function, and the second parameter is going to be a delay in milliseconds. So I'm going to pass it, and I'm going to set it to, let's do 1000, which stands for 1000 milliseconds, or that is 1 second. So if I add a console log right here, or as a matter of fact, let me add an alert. That's going to be a bit more intrusive. And I'll say debounced. And now we can call this function delay debounce fn whenever this use effect runs. And you can see we get debounced. And in this case, it actually looks like that it doesn't want me to call it. It's saying delay debounce, timeout has no call signature. So what you need to do in React, whenever you use a timeout in a use effect, you want to make sure to put it at the end and say return callback function clear timeout like this. And then you wrap the function declaration, not a function call, so no parentheses, just the function declaration, which actually clears it. And in this case, I don't even think that we need to mock this with alert to show you how it works. What we can do is actually just put this entire search query right within it. So I'll just put this up. And now whatever code is in here will automatically be debounced. What does that mean? Well, let me show you. If I type a letter A, that it takes 1 second for it to appear. If I type B, that's another second. You can see how it takes 1 second to update the URL. I know that the text right here is a bit small, but hopefully you can see it. But now if I type CD fast, you can notice that they both went together. How? Why did it not take 2 seconds for those letters to appear? Well, that's because as long as you're typing, so I'm typing right now, it's not gonna do anything as long as you don't stop for 1 second. When you stop for 1 second, it'll consider that it is done and it'll send over that request. So check this out. I just sent over hundreds and hundreds of characters, but we haven't yet made a single request to the backend. Whereas in the previous situation, we would have already sent maybe 1,000 requests for data to come back by this time. And I click, it is there in a second. Since developers type a bit faster, we don't need to give them a second between each character. We can give them maybe 300 milliseconds. So this way, if you type React, you can see it immediately appears. But maybe now you want to add something like React CSS mistake, you can see it gets sent. We still minimize the number of requests, but our app is still super performant. In fact, it is more performant than if we didn't delay it, because we don't have to hold the weight of making all of these requests. In simple words, debouncing is a way to control how often a function runs, especially when users are typing a lot. In search boxes, it helps us by waiting a short time after the user stops typing before sending a request. This makes the search faster and reduces unnecessary load on the server. This was such a great lesson, hasn't it? I hope that everything that you've learned in the theory of the state management URL clicked, because now you got to experience it in person by yourself on a real practical example that we're implementing within our application. As a matter of fact, I want to take it a step further, and I want to show to you how this would actually filter the cards. So let's say that we have different questions in our homepage. Those questions will appear right here. Instead of displaying them as p tags, let's actually create a new object called const questions is equal to an array where we have an object of an underscore ID of 1. We can also have a title of the question, something like how to learn React. I want to learn React, can anyone help me? This was written by GitHub Copilot, by the way. Each question can then also have a list of tags or an array of tags. So that's going to be an array where each tag has an underscore ID and a name, such as React, maybe it's going to be JavaScript, and so on. Next, it's also going to have an author, so who created that question. And the author will also have an underscore ID, name, and maybe even image. But let's not worry about that for now. I'll also remove the created at. There we go. You can see how Prettier automatically stylized this for me. And each question will also have a number of upvotes, so how many people found it helpful, the number of answers. It's going to have the number of views, like 100, and it's going to have a created at, which is going to be a new date, and we can just leave it like this. So this is a question. We can for now duplicate this question and just have one more below. The second question is how to learn JavaScript. Let's do it that way. Now we can map over those questions by going down and saying questions.map, where we go over a question. And for each question, we can render an H1 that's going to render the question.title. Looks like I didn't close it properly. Now it's good. And let's also give it a key, since we're mapping over it, of question._ID. Oh, and looks like we forgot to change the key. This is pretty cool that now Next.js or React are giving us a warning about the same keys. So the second one will have an ID of 2. And you can see it now, how to learn React and how to learn JavaScript. Now, how can we use this search to actually filter out these questions? Well, let me show you. We'll again use something that is completely new to Next.js. If I head over to the top of the homepage, I will just collapse these questions, and actually I'll put them outside of the component since they're static right now, and soon enough we'll update them with the real data coming straight from our database. But for now, the question is, how can we actually extract the current search term from the URL so we can filter out through our database fetch data? Well, for that, we can destructure search params. While we're here, let's also specify its type, and we can call it search params. So let's define an interface of search params, and we can make that equal to a promise. Yep, this is new. In newer versions of Next.js, you now have to await search params. So we can say that this promise will return an object where key of a type string contains a specific string value. What do I mean by that? String. Well, I mean something like query is equal to React. That's basically it. So now that we have the search params, how do we extract the query from it? Well, we can say const query is equal to await search params. And now what? Now we can use the query to modify the fetch from our database. If we had a real fetch, that would look something like this. Const data is equal to await axios.get or something, where we get the questions, where we pass the data of search or query into it. So you can get real data based on that query. At this point in the course, we don't yet have the real data. We'll do that very, very soon. But still, I want to show you how this would work in a real example. So what we can do is say const filtered questions is equal to questions.filter. And we want to get each question that question.title.toLowercase includes the query.toLowercase. And to make sure that the query is there and it doesn't break our application, we can add a question mark right here. Perfect. And finally, we can render the filtered questions. I'll also hide this home filter for now so we can have a clearer view of what's happening. And while we expected to see all of the questions initially, since the search bar is empty, there are no questions there. That's because query could be undefined at the start. So if it is undefined or falsy, we can actually give it a default value of an empty string. So that way, the includes will actually work if it's an empty string. This is a pretty cool JavaScript feature that not a lot of people know about, and I like using it. So now, let's put it to the test. If I search for React, you can see only React, and if I search for JavaScript, you can only see JavaScript. Let's actually expand this to full view so you can see the URL bar. There we go, query JavaScript, query React, and thanks to our remove URL keys from query, if we delete it, plain URL, both questions right here. This was such a great lesson, wasn't it? You got a chance to practice the URL state management in Next.js that you learned a lot about in our theory lessons about state management in Next.js. But now you got a chance to actually put it to the test within the application you're building. I mean, this is already looking great with the left sidebar and the right sidebar as well. That collapses to create some more space for the main content on tablet devices. And then of course, mobile works seamlessly. In Next.js, there's no Zestand needed or no Redux, no React context. You can manage everything using the good old URL bar. And you also learn how to debounce your inputs to make them more efficient. Everything is also completely secured because we're using the query string package, so we can be sure that it's going to properly parse and stringify it. So great work so far, and this definitely deserves a commit. That way you can properly track everything on GitHub. So I'll say implement local search bar. I'll commit it, sync it, and if you head over to GitHub, go to commits, as you know, you can see the full commit history and you can explore exactly which changes we implemented in this commit. That way, whenever you're developing some of your own custom applications and your application needs to use a search, which most of them will know how to do it properly using best practices. And if you need to check out the entire code base at this specific point in time, you can do that easily and just press the dot on your keyboard and it'll open it up right in your browser. I mean, with all of those skills under your tool belt, you already are a great developer. Being able to see a Figma design, think about the architecture of how you're going to approach building it, then very quickly build those components, implement the logic in the best way possible, and then ship it to the clients. That's what you're built to do as a great Next.js developer. So great job in this one. Take a bit of a break, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Now that we've implemented the search, let's implement filtering. I'll go to the components folder and create a new folder called filters and create a new component called home filter.tsx. I'll run rafce. I'll head over to the page in the root, which is our home page. And where we have the home filter text, I will actually turn it into a home filter component. So let's automatically import it and head into it. Believe it or not, the home filter component will work very similarly to the search component. Think of this as your exercise of re-implementing what you implemented in the search to recap your knowledge. First, let's define different filters that we'll have. Const home page filters, or we can call it just filters in this case, since we are already on the home page, is going to be equal to an array of different objects, like name is all and value is all. In this case, I'll call it newest, and the value will be newest. And we can repeat the same thing for something like popular. And again, popular here. Let's do it 2 more times. 1 more time for unanswered. Same thing right here as unanswered. And finally, we'll have recommended. So these are going to be questions specifically recommended for you by the algorithm. Now that we have those filters, let's actually map over them to show different buttons for each one of these filters by saying filters.map, where we map over each individual filter, and for each one, we can return a button component coming from UI buttons. Each button will of course render the filter.name. And since we're mapping over it, we have to give it a key equal to filter.name as well, since each filter is unique. And would you look at that, we have 4 nice looking buttons. Now let's style this div by giving it a class name of margin top of 10. Let's hide those on small devices, so we can say hidden. Give it a flex dash wrap, so we wrap them. Gap of 3, and on medium devices, we want to put flex, so we can show them. Or actually, maybe even on small devices, we have enough space to show them. So if I expand this just a tiny bit, you can see that now we have enough space for the filters. Next, let's give each button a class name equal to body-medium, rounded-LG, padding X of 6, padding Y of 3, capitalize, and shadow-none. And of course, they haven't been applying because I misspelled the class name. There we go. Now this is a bit better. I can expand it just a tiny bit more. There we go. Now to each one of these, we also want to give specific class names depending on if that filter is currently selected or not. So let's create a new use state, active, and set active at the start equal to an empty string. Import use state from React and turn this into a use client component, considering that we are clicking the buttons. And this has to be the same as with the search. Each one of these clicks on these filters will change the URL bar. So we actually have to fetch the value of the query string to know which one is currently selected or not. For that, what are we going to use? If you don't know, you can look into the local search bar, but we're going to use search params. So let's do just that. Let's say const search params is equal to use search params, and we can import this from next navigation. We can then get access to filter params by saying they're equal to search params.getFilter. And we can set the use state to be equal to either filter params if they exist or empty. Now that we have them, we'll be able to know which one is active. And based on that, we can give specific class names. So let's turn this into CN, which stands for class name. That's going to get all of these default classes. So we can just put them in a template string. And then as the second parameter to this, we can check if the active class is active for that specific filter. So filter.value. And if it is, we can return one string. And if it's not, we can return another. So what are we going to use for non-active filters? Let's do a BG light of 800, text-light-500, hover of BG light 800, on dark mode, BG dark 300, on dark mode, text-light 500, and on dark mode, on hover, BG dark 300. There we go. But what about the active ones? Well, let's give it a BG primary 100, text-primary 500, on hover, BG primary 100, on dark, BG dark 400, on dark, text-primary 500, and on dark and hover, BG dark 400. Okay, so now as soon as we select one, when we implement the functionality to do so, you'll be able to see the active classes as well. So how can we actually select one? Do we have to add a use effect, same as what we have done here, and then track the changes in the filters? What do you think? Think about it and try to answer me in 3, 2, 1. No, we don't need a use effect because we can track click events. So let's create a function, const handle type click is equal to a function that accepts the filter that we're clicking on of a type string, and for each one, it can set it as active. So if there actually is a filter that we're clicking, In that case, we can set active to be equal to the filter. Else, if there is no filter, we can set active to be an empty string. Now, if we head over to our buttons, we can actually give it an onClick property by saying onClick is a callback function where we call handle type click, where we pass in the filter.value. But if we click on these, they're going to seem active because they are right now as we're changing the state. As you can see, set active filter. But we're not actually changing the URL bar, which is the only thing we actually care about. Not the state of the UI, but the general state of the application. So how are we going to change the URL bar? What do you think? Once again, I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to think about it. You can look into the search bar, maybe something useful here. Or would this just work for search? Well, no. Check this out. I can copy the place where we modify the form URL query for the search. I'll paste it right here below set active. I'll import form URL query. Instead of changing the query, I'll change it to filter. And the value will not be a search query. It'll be filter dot to lowercase. And what do we do when we want to remove a filter? Well, we already know that as well. It is right here in the local search bar. We call remove keys from URL query. And we can paste it right here. Import it from libutils. And then at the end, so below both the if and the else, we need to use the router.push. So right at the top, let's say const router is equal to use router from next router. Oh, no, it's not next router. Now you know where it is coming from. It should be coming from next navigation, right? So let's not make that mistake again. And at the end, below the else, we can say router.push. And we want to simply push to a new URL. And we can pass a scroll is set to false, as we don't want to scroll to the top. This new URL currently is defined in both of these if blocks. So instead, let's actually create a new let new URL is equal to an empty string at the top, just so we have access to it within this scope right here. So we can use it below, but instead of setting it right here each time, we can just modify the value. And now we have access to the new URL. Now check this out. If I click newest, filter newest. I click on popular, filter popular, unanswered, recommended, and so on. This is working perfectly. Do we need to implement the debounce here? What do you think? Well, the answer is no, because the user will only click on one at a time. And how can a user remove a filter once it's selected? Like we can click on another, but can we remove all of them? What do you think? How would you implement that? You can do it by switching these to if and else statements. First, I'll check if filter is equal to the currently active filter. If it is, then what we can do is clear things up. So I will simply set active to nothing and remove keys from URL query. And then I will put the set active into the else. So if we're not clicking on the current one, that must mean that we're clicking on another one. So we want to turn it on. So I click popular or others, it still works, but I click again on the selected one and it gets unselected. But as you can see, in the URL bar, it still remained there. That's because I forgot to change this remove keys from URL query. Which key are we removing? Well, this function is super reusable. The only thing we have to do is change this to filter. If we do that, click newest, it's there, unclick it, it is gone. Great work on implementing the filters. And as you can see, it all starts coming into place. Once you truly understand how search params, client and server components, and filtering works behind the scenes, it's just super easy to work with it. And wait, how are we going to get access to the filter right here in our homepage? Well, we can just extract it from the search params by saying filter. Currently, we have filters for newest, popular, unanswered, and recommended. These are more so sorts than filters, but that's okay. For the time being, I will comment them out and I'll create a name all, value nothing, Well, we don't really need it because if it's not clicked, that means that it's going to show all. But let's do React and let's do JavaScript as well. Okay, and of course we have to change the values. So this is going to be JavaScript and this one right here will be React. If we do that and expand our browser, we now have React and JavaScript. So how do we actually make these work with the filtering of the content? We can go back to the page. We can accept the filter, make it equal to an empty string if it's not doing anything, and then we can further filter the questions. Since this is very messy code right now, and we'll definitely remove it later on with proper API fetches from the database, I'll just use GitHub Copilot to do it for me. I'll say Command-Shift-I or Control-Shift-I, select the code, and I'll say something like filter questions based on filters 2. There we go. To filter the questions, it gave me this block of code, which I will simply insert. There we go. Let's see what it did. It said questions.filter matches query. Okay, so it's matching for the title, but is it actually matching for the filter too? Let's see. Const matches filter. Question.category. Oh no, I think it's going to be tags. Okay, so question.tags, but tags is actually an array. So if we want to make it work with that, we actually have to map over the tags. But you know what? For now, I'll just say tags 0 because the first one should actually be the one that matches. For JavaScript, I'll set it to JavaScript. And for React, it's already set to React. So now I'll say tags 0 dot name because a tag has a name, and then dot to lowercase. So now if I save this and I select React, you can see it filters out React. And if I unclick it, we can see both. And here I can see just JavaScript. This is pretty cool, right? So we can now do it based both on search or how to learn, which finds both. And then I can further filter it by a filter. Check this out. A filter and a query working together. So this means that what we're working on is completely extensible. Great job implementing filters. Let's say implement home filters, commit, sync, and we are ready for the next lesson. Page and create a better looking question card. Yep, this one that is just a simple H1 just doesn't cut it for me. So let's actually head over to components, cards, and then create a new question card.tsx. Run RAFCE, import it right here where we're rendering the H1. Let's call it a question card coming from components question card. Of course, it'll have a key equal to question._ID, and then we'll pass over the full question information to each one of these question cards. So let's head over into the question card and let's accept all of these props. We're going to get them in form of a question, but we can further destructure those props so we can easily reach them. We're going to get the _ID, the title, the tags, the author, the created at, upvotes, answers, and views. And this will be of a type props. So right here, we can define the interface of props and say that a question is of a type. And now what you could do is define all of these properties right here. Like you could go very detailed with specifying all of these types right here. But the problem is that you'll need to reuse this type or this interface quite often because the question is the root data type in our application. We see it in almost every single page. So what would be a better way of storing that type or the interface so we can reuse it in other cases? Well, for that, we can define a global TypeScript type. So head over to your File Explorer and create a new folder called Types. Within Types, create a new file called global.d, which stands for definition, .ts. Here you can declare global types in TypeScript, which will help you keep your code organized and reusable. We can share these types across whichever files you type right here, like interface, question. You'll be able to reuse across all the other files without even needing to import them. making it easier to manage and reduce errors. It'll significantly improve your TypeScript developer experience. So each question has an underscore ID of a type string. It has a title of a type string. It doesn't have a description in our case, but it does have tags with the underscore ID and a name, which is an array of those tags. And this is also a pretty cool thing. If you're gonna end up reusing some other subtype often, you can turn it into its own interface and then build those bigger interfaces like Lego building blocks. Like let's say that each tag has an ID and a string. You can just say right here, the tags in the question is just an array of different tag interfaces. We can repeat the same thing with the author by declaring the interface user, or no, it's gonna be an author because they create each one of these questions. So it's gonna have an ID or underscore ID of a string. It's gonna have a name of a string and maybe even an image of a type string. So within the question, we can say author is gonna be author. Created at is gonna be of a type date. And then it's gonna have upvotes of a type number, answers of a type number, and views of a type number as well. Now, if we head over to the question card, we can define questions as simply an array of questions. And if you control or command click in it, it's gonna lead you straight to this interface. But as you can see, if you hover over it, it's gonna say question is not defined coming from ESLint. This is an issue with ESLint when working on TypeScript projects. And the actual recommended solution is to simply turn off ESLint for these types of issues. So let's head over to our eslint.rc.json, scroll down, let's go right here to overrides, set it as an array, specifically focus on files, everything.ts and everything.tsx, and rules, no undef, so no undefined, will be simply set to off. Oh, and I noticed there's a little typo here. This is supposed to say no undef. And if you did this properly, head over back to the question card and check it out. The error is gone. And now TypeScript knows that this question right here is referring to the question interface, which is amazing because if you try to use something like underscore ID, it'll actually know of which type it is. But let's see, why is it complaining about this? It's saying title does not exist, and that's it. Yep, it's saying title does not exist. Let's see, what did we use in the original page right here? We said question title, okay. Oh, they're saying question array. Actually, this is not an array. This is just one single question. So if we do it like this, now it knows that this ID is specifically a string. We can use it within our application. And it knows that it is a string. Great. So let's create the UI of our question by wrapping everything in a div and giving it a class name of card-wrapper, rounded-10 pixels, to give it some smoother edges, a padding of 9, on small devices, padding X of 11. Within this div, let's create another div that'll have a class name equal to flex, flex-call reverse, items-start, justify-between, a gap of 5, and on small devices, a flex of row. Within it, we can have just an empty div, which we'll use for positioning. And then within that div, we can have a span, which will render the created at property. So when was this question created? And created at is actually a date. So we need to either stringify it, so dot to string. So we can wrap it in a string constructor like this, or we need to have some other function which will actually turn this into a human readable format. So let's actually do the latter because this is definitely not looking good. I'll head over to lib and then utils. And then within here, we can create a new utility function called const get timestamp. And it's gonna take in a date of a type date. And we needed to return a timestamp of how long ago was this date. And this is the perfect type of situations that I use ChatGPT for. So head over to ChatGPT, give it this function constructor, and say to create a function that takes in a date and returns a string specifying how long ago was it created, like 5 seconds ago, or days, or hours, and simply run it. It should give us a pretty simple function into a human-readable time ago format. I like how it called that. Let's copy the code, and let's paste it right here. Okay, I think this is gonna look good. And let's actually export it. And now back in the question card, we can call, how did we call it? Get timestamp, import it, and pass the created at into it. And if you do that, it says just now for both of these, 2 seconds ago, 3 seconds ago. Why is that? Well, that is because in our question, we actually provided a date.now. But if I use some random date, like let's do, there we go, ChatGPT for some reason autofilled this date for me. You can see this was 3 years ago. And then this one for some reason is still cached. And then this one says now because we have a new date. But it's good to know that this get timestamp actually works. Now let's actually render a question title. That's going to be an H3. And we can render just the title. How to learn React, how to learn JavaScript. Let's style it a bit by giving it a class name of on small devices, H3 semi-bold, typically base semi-bold, text dash dark 200, light 900, line dash clamp dash 1, and flex dash 1. There we go, that's better. Let's also wrap it in a link, because once we click on this specific title, we want to navigate over to the question details page. So let's give it a link with an href pointing to routes coming from constants routes dot question, and we want to pass in the question ID, not ask question. It's going to be just question details. So we need to get over to the routes and create a new one that's going to point to the question. So that's going to be / questions ID. So / question ID. Let's also style the span by giving it a class name of subtle regular, text dash dark 400, light 700, line dash clamp dash 1. What this does is it allows it to take maximum of 1 line of space, property flex, and on small devices hidden, because if we're looking at a larger screen, then we'll want to show just the title, and on the right side we'll show something else. But on small devices, we can't show it. This is looking good to me. So now we can go below the link and below 2 more divs, and we can create a div which will create some space for the next section that we're working on. This one will be about tags. So let's give it a class name of margin top of 3.5, flex, W full, flex dash wrap, and a gap of 2 in between the tags. And here we want to map over our tags and display them. Thankfully, if you remember, we have already built our reusable tag card. So let's simply go inside and say tags.map, and for each specific tag, we can automatically return a tag card coming from /tag card. To it, we can pass a couple of different things. The first one being the key, since we're mapping over it, equal to tag._id. And now that we have our global type for the tag, we can actually just use it here. It'll automatically know exactly which properties each tag has. We can also pass the _ID equal to tag._id, and let's do a name equal to tag.name. Finally, in this case, we want to use a compact version of the card, so we can pass in compact. And we can see that the tag card type requires questions, but actually it's going to be optional. So let's set it as optional here as well. For now, we don't have to worry about this compact thing not being used. I'll explain what that is when we use the tag card in some other context. As you know, we can completely change how a specific reusable component looks and feels based on its context and the props that we pass into it. But as you can see, just by default, this works perfectly. We have React and JavaScript with their corresponding logos, and then JS and JS at the same time at the bottom, because as you know, these are just fake questions right now. Now, what else does each one of our question cards need to have? Some info about the author, when it was asked, and then info about the votes, answers, and views. So let's add those next to make this card complete. As you can see, the question card itself is being reused many times. But even within the card, we have some reusable components, such as this one right here, where we reuse the tag multiple times. In this case, we use our own improved version of the card with the icon. But there's one more thing which we reuse a couple of times, and that is this thing right here, which we can call a metric, which has an icon and then a number of votes, answers, and views. So let's create a new component in the components folder, and we can call it metric.tsx. Run rafce, and then we can import it right within the question card. How is that going to look like? Well, let's go below this div and create another div that'll have a class name equal to flex-between, margin top of 6, w-full, flex-wrap, so we can show them even on the devices with a lower screen width, and a gap of 3 in between the metrics. Now right here, we can create our first metric component by importing the metric, and we can pass it a couple of props. We can pass it an image URL, like which image do we want to show. In this case, we'll be talking about the author of the post, who created it. So we can pass the author dot, let's see how we called it. If I go to page home, we called it author, and it has an ID. It also has a name. Let's make sure that it has an image. So right here, we can give it some kind of an image. And since we don't yet have real images, I'll just go to Google and search for an avatar image, and I will copy a link address. Or no, we have to copy an image address for this to work, and I'll paste it right here. Now for the second question, we also need to add an image, and I'll make it the same one. So I'll just paste it here. Great, so we have added an image right now, and going back to this metric, now we can say that the image URL is equal to author.image. We can also pass an alt tag equal to author.name, and we can pass a value equal to author.value. And in this case, we're working with this one right here. So we have to have an image, a name, and then we're going to have a title of this specific metric, which is going to say asked 2 minutes ago. So we'll copy this part and provide it a title equal to a template string of asked 2 minutes ago, but instead of 2 minutes, I will actually call the get timestamp, which we created, and I'll pass in the created at property that belongs to each one of these questions. Next, we can also give it an href to where this will point to when we click it, and that's going to be routes.profile, and it's going to point to author._id. We can give it some special text styles, which are going to be equal to body-medium and text-dark 400 _ light 700. And I'll give it a special isAuthor Boolean variable, because you can see that this isAuthor is quite different than these three right here. These are going to be metrics as well, just so we know how to properly show them. Now, if you go back, you can see a singular metric here. But now let's go below this metric and let's create another div. The other 3 metrics will be contained within this div, as they have to be closer together. So let's give it a class name of flex, items-center, gap of 3, on max SM devices flex-wrap, and on max SM devices justify-start. Now within here, we can render a metric. This one will show what? Well, let's see. It'll show votes. So let's focus on the votes first by passing it an image URL equal to /icons/like.svg. We can pass it an alt tag equal to like. We can pass it a value, which is going to be equal to the number of upvotes. We can pass it a title, which is going to be empty space and then votes. And finally, we can pass text styles, which are going to be equal to small-medium, text-dark 400, and light 800. And now I can duplicate this one 2 more times. The second one will talk about answers. So we can give it an image URL of message. The alt tag will be answers. The value will be answers. The title will be answers. And the classes can remain the same. And the third one is talking about views. So right here, we can render an I SVG, call it views, render views, and the title will be views. If we save it and go back, you can see that now we have 1 metric on the left side and 3 metrics on the right side. And all of them are exactly the same. So now we have to do what reusable components do, accept all the props and then render them depending on the context. So to do it, let's destructure all the props, such as img URL, the alt tag, the value, the title, the href, the text styles, maybe even the image styles if we have them in the future, and is author. We can also define these as props. So now we can define those props right here at the top by saying interface props, and then here we can define all of them. As you can see, a perfect example of where Copilot does it completely for me. Beautiful. And now we can render a metric. Now, some of these metrics should be clickable and some should not be. So how do we know whether we wrap it in a link or whether we wrap it in a div? Well, check this out. Well, we'll define some always present content that each metric will have. Const metric content, which will be equal to, let's do just an empty React fragment for now. And then before we return, we'll check if an href is present, and if it is, we'll return a link containing that href, and then we can render the metric content within it. Else, if we don't have an href, we will render a div, and then we'll add the metric content within it. And let's not forget to import link from next link. I think we have to properly close it here, and then again close it here. So does this make sense? Like, we will always show some kind of a metric, but if we have href, we will wrap it in a link, else it'll simply be a div. Now, how will that metric content look like? Well, first we'll render an image. And this image will have a source equal to img URL. If you do this, it'll break because we haven't defined the image, so let's import it. But once you import it, it'll also break because we have to give it a width and a height. So let's give it a width of 16 and a height of 16. But even when you fix that, it'll also break because we haven't yet configured this static image we use from Google under nextconfig.js. So it says that we have to add the host name of static.vecteasy.com. So let's copy it, go to config, and here you'll have to add the following configuration: images, remote patterns, and then here you can define the protocol of HTTPS, a host name equal to whatever your error is saying. For you, it might be different if you picked another avatar image. For me, it is just like this, and port can be empty. If you define this and reload, you can see that now our logo shows. Let's also give this image an alt tag equal to, well, it's just going to be the alt that we're passing in. We can give it a class name equal to, it'll be dynamic, of rounded-full object-contain, and we'll render any image styles if we have passed it through props. There we go. That's a bit better. Now below this image, I'll render a p tag with a class name equal to dynamic. I'll first render the text styles, which we're passing, and then I'll give it flex, items-center, and a gap of 1. And within it, we want to render a value. So this is going to be the number of views, likes, or whatever, and we're also showing the image right here. Right below the value, we want to render a span, and here we want to render a title. There we go. So you can see ask just now, votes, answers, and views. And in case that this right here is an author, we want to hide it on smaller devices. I'll explain soon why. So let's give it a class name of, I'll make it a dynamic template string, small dash regular, line dash clamp dash 1, so it fits into one line. And then if is author, I'll give it a max on small devices hidden, else nothing. So now you can see that on small devices, we won't be able to see when this was created. But if we expand it, you can see that it was asked just now. Why is it that way? Because on smaller devices, a better place to put this timestamp is right here at the top, because we don't have enough space right here on the right side. Why not? Well, because we can further style this link and div by giving them a class name of flex-center gap of 1. If you do that, now we can notice that they take a bit more space, so we cannot really show when this was created. That's great, it looks great on desktop devices, but we're missing who created this specific question. So if we go back to where we're passing specific info to the metric, right here under value, you can see that we're passing author.value, but this was supposed to be author.name. So if you do it that way, you can see John Doe asked this question just now. So it makes more sense to have it here on desktop devices, since we have a lot of space. But on mobile devices, since we don't have a lot of space, it makes more sense to just say just now here, or 3 years ago, and then we can show the avatar as well as other questions. Of course, all of this will look even better once we actually have a real question. Now, it looks like our metric is complaining a bit, saying that value is not assignable type number. So we can fix this over in the metric by saying that value will actually either be a string or a number. href will be optional, and image styles will also be optional because we don't need to have them. Great. And with that, we're done with the metric, which means we're done with the entire card as well. Oh, there's a slight issue here with the created at does not exist on the type question. So let's see whether that is truly the case. Yep, I am missing the created at. So we can add created at, which is going to be of a type date. Great. So now we're using proper types in the question card using the global TypeScript declaration. And what we can do to make it more type safe is right here where we're mapping over the tags. Oh, we already did that. We said that each tag is of a type tag. So now it knows exactly which properties does it have. Great. So that's it. You have just created a completely reusable question card with its own tags that you can click to and go to them, that you can click the author as well to check out their profile. And later on, you'll also be able to check out real votes, answers, and views. Of course, fully mobile responsive as everything else. And works great on light mode too. So let's go ahead and merge that. I'll say something like implement question card, commit and sync. And that's it. The UI of our homepage has been implemented. Very soon, we'll be able to hook this up to a database and we'll be able to see the questions that people ask. But to see the questions or to fetch them, we first need to be able to create them. So implementing the Ask a Question page will be our next step. To get started creating the Ask a Question page, let's click the Ask a Question button to navigate to it. That's going to lead us to Ask a Question or Ask Question page right here in a root Ask Question. But now we want to create a new client-side component, which is going to be the question form, which we can import and use within the server-side rendered Ask a Question page. So let's create a new component right here inside of components and then forms and call it question form.tsx. Run rafce and import it within the Ask a Question page in a way that first we'll have an h1 right here at the top that's going to say Ask a Question, and we can give it a class name equal to h1-bold, text-dark 100, light 900, and save it. There we go. That's already looking better. We don't need to provide any styles to this div, so let's simply make it a React fragment. And right within it, let's render a div with a class name equal to margin top of 9 to divide it a bit from the top. And within it, render a question form, self-closing component. That's it. Now we can head over into the question form and start implementing it. So let's ask ourselves, what kind of fields will we need to have within our question form? So we can head over to create a question, which is right here. Ask a public question. First of all, we have a question title. Then we have a detailed explanation of the problem, and then up to 5 tags that we can add for each one of the questions. So before we actually go ahead and create the UI for the form, let's first write the validation by heading over to validations.ts, where right now we have the validation for the sign in and the sign up. Now we can create a new one by running export const ask question schema equal to z.object, to which we can pass the shape of a title equal to z.string, and you can see that already it autofills it for me. So I will actually let it autofill it. For the title, we have a z.string with a minimum of 5 and a maximum of 100 characters. And then instead of body, let's call this content, where we have a string with a minimum of 1 character, meaning that it is required. And in this case, I don't even want to provide a max because sometimes coding questions can get long. Finally, we need to have our tags, which are going to be equal to z.array of strings. But for each string, we can actually provide some additional validations by saying it's going to be a min of 1 character, saying tag is required, and then another .max, where we can say tag cannot exceed 30 characters. And instead of saying that it should be non-empty, we can say that we can have a minimum of 1 tag, at least 1 tag is required, and we can have a .max of 3. So we can say 3 tags is the maximum, cannot add more than 3 tags. So now we have the validation for our question form, which we can use right here. I know that we have already set a couple of Chatcn forms, but I want to guide you to do this one more time from scratch so you truly understand how creating forms in Chatcn using Zod validation and the React hook form works. First things first, we need to create a new form by saying const form is equal to use form coming from React hook form. To it, we need to pass a resolver, which resolves to a specific schema. So we can say Zod resolver coming from hook form, and to it, we need to pass the schema we created, ask question schema. And the second part is going to contain the default values for this specific form, which in this case will be a title of an empty string, it'll be content of an empty string, and finally tags of an empty array. And now you can see we have our form, which we can then use within the UI. So let's actually create a new form and make sure that this is a UI form. So coming from Chatcn components and not React hook form. Okay, so check the import and make sure it is /UI/form. And to this form, you need to spread the form component that we created right above. Then within it, we can create a regular HTML form, give it a class name equal to flex, w-full, flex-call, and a gap of 10 in between the elements. Now, it seems that we have a problem saying that use form coming from React hook form doesn't exist, even though if we go into it, we can see that it is indeed exporting it right here. I think the issue is happening because we haven't added a use client directive at the top. If you save it, you'll see that now it's fixed. I do agree that this is slightly problematic because the initial error is misleading, but it cannot get the correct use form hook because we haven't added the use client here. So sometimes you might be careful that it's not just the use states or the built-in hooks that you can use that require you to transform something into a use client component. Sometimes it's third-party libraries like React hook form. So once we switch it to use client, it works. Now let's continue with the form. I'll give it an onSubmit handler. So what's going to happen once we submit? And you can just say form.handleSubmit, and then you pass in the function that you want to run when you submit it. I'll call it handle create question, because that's exactly what we want to do, create a question once we submit the form. So I'll define this const handle create question, which is going to be a empty callback function for now. There we go. No complaints so far. Now let's head over to inside of the form and let's create the first form field. In this case, I actually want to head over to some of our previous forms like the auth form just to copy a form field because they're mostly the same. So I'll copy the entire form field in this case, all the way from the start to the self-closing tag. And I'll paste it right here within the form. Now, of course, we'll style it to make sense in this case. We have a form field, which we have to import from UI form. The key we don't need because we're not mapping over these. The name in this case will actually be just the title, which is going to be a static title string because first we want to have the title of the question. Then we want to render a form item, and this form item will have a flex, wfull, and flex call. No need to provide a gap in this case. After that, we have a form label, which we can also import, which is going to have a paragraph semi-bold, text-dark 400, light 800. And within it, we don't have to do any sort of logic. We can simply say question title, and then we can render a span that's going to just render the asterisk, meaning it's mandatory to enter this field. I'll give it a class name of text-primary-500. So now if we save it, it's still going to be broken because we have to fix the import. So let's import the input. We have to do it at the top by saying import input, not from post CSS. That was a mistake. It has to come from UI input. We can remove the required and the type. We're going to spread the field. But before we do, we can fix these class names. It's going to be paragraph regular. It's going to have a no focus with a background light 700, dark 300, light border 2, text dark 300, light 700, min-h of 56 pixels. So we can manually type 56 pixels right here. No need to give it rounded in this case. And we can give it border. And this is how that input looks like. Great. Right below the input and below the form control, in this case, we can add a form description. So let's say form description coming from UI form, and it's going to have a class name equal to body-regular, text-light-500, and a margin top of 2.5. Within it, we can render some kind of information for this field. Be specific and imagine you're asking a question to another person. There we go. And now what we can do is we can duplicate this field 2 more times. So 1 and 2. And now we can fix them for each one of these. The second form field will not be a title, it'll be content. So we can change the label to say detailed explanation of your problem, like this. Then inside of here, we won't render the regular input, rather we'll render the editor component, which will allow us to in detail specify the problem that we have with some code blocks and more. We can also fix the description to say something like introduce the problem and expand on what you've put in the title and save. Okay, that's great. Soon enough, we'll add a real editor right here. And then for the last one, we'll have a name equal to tags where we'll render a form item. And in this case, we can give it a gap of 3 in between the elements, where we're gonna render a form label with a title of tags. And within it, within the form control, we'll want to render a div. And then within the form control, we can render a div. We can put this input within a div and give it a placeholder equal to add tags. And then below it, we'll want to map over the tags that were created and show them right here. So I'll simply say tags. Of course, this part will come later. And we can also modify the description by saying something like add up to 3 tags to describe what your question is about. You need to press enter to add a tag. Okay, great. Finally, going below this entire input, we can render a div that'll have a class name equal to margin top of 16, flex, and justify end. And here we can simply render a submit button coming from UI buttons with a type equal to submit. a class name of primary dash gradient, and exclamation mark, text dash light dash 900, and w dash fit. Within it, we can say ask question. There we go. So now we have a beautiful button, ask a question right here at the bottom right. It seems like we have some warnings, and you'll see those warnings are because this field is not used right here in the form field. We also have some warnings because the quote string is not escaped. So it gives you right here the code that you need to use to escape that quote string. So I'll just write like this. Same thing here. And I think that's it. We don't have any more. You can see that it still has the quote, but now it's not complaining. And with that in mind, the UI of the question form is looking great, as you can see here. But now we have to dive into creating a detailed editor that will allow us to bold, italicize, or provide headings, or quote different things, or even put hyperlinks and blocks of code so we can explain our bug more properly so people can provide us with a better solution. And let me just tell you that we will reuse this editor also when providing different answers. So that way, people that provide answers will be able to help us in a more seamless way. So let me commit this right here by saying implement the UI of the question form, commit and sync. And next, we can focus on implementing the MDX editor. Even more delightful. As you can see, you can bold text, you can italicize, you can underline, you can do hyperlinks, paragraphs, quotes, and even code blocks. What we want in this case is to head over to the live demo and check out some of the live coding functionalities, like these ones right here. You can see that you have complete language highlighting, which was one of the big reasons why I chose this specific editor, and it actually works for both light and dark mode. What's pretty cool is that this code editor actually suggests things as you type. So if I bring this back over to JavaScript and I say const test is equal to, it's actually suggesting things as I type. So I can say console.log and I can console log the test. Pretty cool, right? For a built-in Markdown editor. And best of all, it is completely open source. So let me show you how to use it. We can go over to the terminal and run npm install --save at mdx editor /editor. After that, we can create a new editor component in the components folder /editor. And then within the editor, we can create a new index.tsx file, meaning that this will be the only file in there and it'll be called the editor. Now we can import it within our question form. So let's head over here where we have the editor, and within the form control, I'll import a self-closing editor component, just like this. So if we now dive into the editor, we can now start using it. And how I like to start using specific packages is by following their documentation. So I'll head over to get started. And as you can see, we run the command, and now we can just import the React component and use it within our project. So let's copy those two imports right here at the top of the editor component, import MDX editor and its corresponding styles. After you do that, we can basically get everything else as well. And you can see they have use client here, meaning that this is specifically made for Next.js with the app router. So let's get this first example right here. And I'll actually override what we have here. And I will move this return statement right here within our existing code. And I'll also copy these props and the types. So let me copy it. Delete everything we have here. And now I will put them right here. We get the editor ref and the props, and we get the proper types for all of them. If I save it, you can see that we have the use client at the top. We have a couple of imports, and then we have import type forwarded ref from React. If we head on down, you can see we have the Next.js pages router, Vite, and so on. In this case, I'm fine with just the regular editor. Looks like I have a double form control. Yep, that's a mistake. If I fix that, and if I go back into the editor, it seems like there's some kind of an issue, cannot read properties of undefined, reading trim. It could be because we're not passing the actual editor ref. So what we can do is go back to the question form and define a new use ref right here at the top of the form. Const editor ref is equal to use ref, which is coming from React. we can set that it is a type of MDX editor methods type, and then at the start, it's going to be set to null. Now we can take that editor ref and we can pass it over to the editor component as editor ref is equal to editor ref. We can also pass in the value, which is going to be equal to field that value, so we can keep track of it. And also field change is going to be equal to on change, or rather it's going to be field dot on change. Now we can head over to the editor and accept those additional props. In this case, that's going to be the value, and we can add the value right here of a type string to the props, as well as field change, which is going to be of a type function that accepts the value of a type string and returns void, meaning nothing. We have a lot of types right here, so it might be better to just extract them to the top. So I will copy all of the types, remove it right here, and define a new interface. Interface props is equal to an object where we have the value of a type string. We have a field change with a value of string that returns void. And finally, we have an editor ref, which is a forwarded ref with the MDX editor methods or null. And now we can say that this is of a type props. Now we still have an issue right here. And I think that's because I didn't properly read what it says right here. It says that the MDX editor does not support server rendering, so we need to ensure that the component is only rendered on the client side. To do so, we can use the dynamic utility with SSR false. Make sure that the editor plugins are initialized client-side only. Using some plugins will cause hydration errors if imported during server-side rendering. So on top of this, they also put this special file where the only place where we initialize the editor component is directly, and we make sure that we turn the SSR off. So let's actually copy this part right here, const editor dynamic, and let's use that within the question form right here, above where we declare the question form. Here we can define our editor by importing dynamic from next dynamic, and then importing this editor from @/components/editor. And now this is basically a new version of this component, which will only be rendered client side. So we can use that instead of manually importing the editor like we did before. Now, if we go back to the editor component, we can pass it a property of markdown, which is going to be equal to the value that we're passing in. We can also pass it an on change, which is going to be equal to field change, which we have to accept right here through props. If you do that, you'll notice that all the errors in the MDX editor are gone. In the same way, all the errors within the files are gone, both with the question form that now nicely renders a server-side only editor and within the editor component too. But unfortunately, there is still another error saying error evaluating Node.js code CSS syntax error, pointing to the globals.css file where it says that the pros class does not exist. Make sure pros is a custom class and it is defined within a layer directive. Now, what does this even mean? Well, it's because pros is the utility of Tailwind CSS. I can show it to you here. If you head over to Tailwind CSS typography and search for pros, you can see that Tailwind CSS typography plugin provides a set of pros classes that you can use to add beautiful typographic defaults to any vanilla HTML you don't control. So since we're adding that pros to the editor and using it within the globals.css, if you search for pros, you'll be able to see it right here. We actually need to install it to be able to use it. So to install it, we can just install a new package by running npm install -d for development at Tailwind CSS /typography. Once it gets installed, you'll have to mention it under tailwind.config.ts right here at the bottom where we have plugins, require Tailwind CSS animate, and we can also add another one, require, and we're going to add Tailwind CSS /typography, or that's going to be at Tailwind CSS /typography. We have to close this function right here. I just noticed I didn't close it. And if we do that, you can see that we have a TypeScript ESLint error, but the code should actually be working. So now if you go back, we no longer have an error, but we have a huge editor that we can now add plugins to. So let me show you how that works. You can head over in the editor and go to the docs. And then once you go over the installation, we can actually expand this and see different things that you can use within the editor, like the quote plugin, the toolbar plugin that allows you to specify which elements you want to have in the toolbar, the link plugin. All of these are different plugins that you can use. Of course, we'll leverage code blocks, HTML support, and more. And you can also go to the API reference if you really want to research how specific things work. But in this case, you don't have to worry about that because I'll show you exactly what we need to do to achieve the necessary look and feel. First of all is the markdown, which is the current value that you pass to it, like the default value. If I say hello world and reload, you can see that it says hello world right here. But we want to only keep our value, so the value that we're using, by typing something in. Next, we can pass some class names. So let's say class name is equal to background dash light 800 underscore dark 200, light dash border dash 2, markdown dash editor, dark dash editor, w dash full for full width, and border. If you save it, you can see that it's going to look more similar to our other inputs, but it's going to complain that dark editor is not a Tailwind CSS class. So how can we fix that? Well, let's create a new file right here and let's call it dark-editor.css. And within here, we can put some code that refers to the dark editor class. For example, we can say .dark as well as .dark-editor. And here we can define some specific class names for the editor in the dark mode, such as maybe a background color, like Copilot suggests. But now, if we want to account for these changes, we have to go back to the editor and we have to import this by saying import ./dark-editor.css. And now if you change it to something like red, you can see that it completely changes. So this allows you to style it a bit more properly. And I was checking out some GitHub repositories connected with this Markdown editor repo that allow it to look much better in dark mode. And I actually found a finished CSS file that I will copy and paste right here. That's what I've done when I was developing it in the first place. As you can see, it just sets the font family, and then it sets up a couple of different accents that we can use in the dark mode. If you do that, the editor won't complain about this dark editor class name because it knows it exists, and it's going to look a bit better. But there's still one thing we need to do to make sure that all the extensions within the editor, such as the code blocks, also properly change colors. And for that, we'll have to install this CM6 theme basic dark package. This basically implements the basic dark package for Code Mirror code editor, which this editor uses behind the scenes. So let's simply install it by running npm install cm6-theme-basic-dark. If we install it, we can simply import it at the top by saying import basic dark coming from cm6 theme basic editor. And I'm going to put it above our CSS import. And now we can define the theme that we're using. We can do that by saying const resolved theme is equal to use theme, which we have to import from next themes. And then we can define the theme by saying const theme extension is equal to, if resolved theme is equal to dark, then use an array of this basic dark packages, like this package which we installed. Else, you can simply use an empty array like this. I struggled a bit with setting all of this up, but this was the final solution that I came up with that actually worked for both the package as well as the extensions within the editor package. But from now on, everything is going to make more sense. Let's actually collapse this just a bit and let's call it theme. Now we can provide additional plugins to this editor. I'll actually put the ref right here above, so we have it next to our markdown, to value, class names on change, and I'll provide it a key equal to resolved theme. So this is the theme coming from used theme, And now we can focus on the plugins. Plugins themselves are just going to make sure that whatever you type in is going to work within the editor. So if I type a double hash, it's going to create a heading 2. If I type a single one, it's going to create a heading 1, and so on. That's the headings plugin. I also have a lists plugin, so I can do bullet point lists. I type it, and it just works. But what if you want to be able to do these by selecting from the navbar? For that, we have to add a toolbar plugin. So let's add it at the bottom, toolbar plugin. And within it, we can have the options where we can define toolbar contents. That's going to be a function. And here we can return conditional contents, which will accept options, which is an array where we can have an object and say when editor, then return editor dot editor type is triple equal to code block. So if the editor is equal to code block, in that case, we can say contents is equal to change code mirror language. Okay, so we only want to show this change code mirror language if the editor is equal to code block. And in this case, I missed a callback function. So we have to choose which component we want to return, like this. Next, the second object within the options array is going to be a fallback. So this means always have this present. And this will be a callback function that's going to return a single React fragment element. And within it, we can show all of the other elements, such as the maybe undo, redo. If I save this, can we see it? Not yet. Let's see why. We have a toolbar plugin, which renders toolbar contents, which is a callback function that returns conditional contents with options. And then we have a fallback. Let's try to render some kind of a separator right here below, coming from Markdown editor. It's like it's saying that we're not returning anything. Type void is not assignable to React Node. So it's saying that we should return something, but oh, check this out. I didn't provide an immediate return right here. I opened a function block, which actually means that we have to add a return right here in front of it, or we can remove the return and then just close it with a parenthesis, which means that it'll be an immediate return. There we go. So now we can see the undo, redo buttons right here. I wanted to say looking great, but it's not looking great quite yet. Let's also add a couple more useful plugins to our toolbar. Let's add a bold, italic, underline toggles, and let's also create another separator right below it. Let's also add a lists toggle so we can have different lists, and add another separator. There we go. So now we can create different types of lists like ordered, unordered, even checkbox lists, which is pretty cool. Next, we can create a hyperlink. So let's say create link, and let's also add insert image. So people can insert images of their coding problems. And I'm going to also add another separator right here. Below it, we can add insert table. Yep, this editor even supports tables. Next, let's do insert thematic break. That is supported as well. So now we can add kind of a line in between, as you can see, pretty cool. And finally, and most importantly, we have insert code block right here at the end. So now we can type here and it's going to insert a code block. Well, almost it will. We have to fix something before that. But now we have created some kind of a header or some kind of a toolbar. Let's say that way. Of course, we'll actually have to style it so it looks better because even on desktop, it's not quite looking good. But before we do that, if I try to create some kind of a bullet list, you can see that it actually works. But it only works because I added a lists plugin. If I commented out the lists plugin and then I try to do a list, you can see that it is not supported. So let's make sure to add the plugins for all of the different functionalities that we have in the toolbar. That's going to be the headings, the lists. We also need to add a link plugin like this. Let's add a link dialog plugin, which is going to allow us to choose a specific link. We have a quote plugin. We have a thematic break plugin. Let's also have a markdown shortcut plugin, a table plugin, because we're going to be using tables as well. We can add an image plugin as well. Most importantly, a code block plugin. to which we can provide a default code block language equal to an empty string, meaning no default language. Next, we can provide a code mirror plugin, to which we can provide an options object, and we can pass the different code block languages that we support. So let's support CSS with a string of CSS. We can also support just plain text by saying txt. We can do SQL. And I think this is the way in which we have to do it. There's no other way. You could maybe map over these. That would be a bit simpler. But for now, let's just write it one by one. HTML is going to be equal to HTML. Next, after that, we're going to have Sass, which is a variation of CSS. We have SCSS. That's another variation of CSS. We can maybe add bash for bash scripts. We can add JSON, always useful. We can also add JavaScript. So JS is JavaScript. We can add TS for TypeScript. We can add an empty string like this for unspecified. We can add TSX for, let's say, TypeScript, React. And let's do JSX for JavaScript, React, like this. This is enough of code block languages. Let's make sure to properly add a line right here after this one. And we can also add auto load language support, set it to true, so we can auto load additional languages. And we can add a code mirror extension equal to theme. So here we're actually allowing the code editor to be of the same theme as our application, be that light or dark. Also, you know that we'll be writing this in Markdown. So would it not be cool to see the plain version of that Markdown, not styled? Like, for example, when you do this, this is basically a hash and then the title. So I want to see an unstyled version so I can copy it and paste it into another Markdown editor. To do that, I can run a diff source plugin and provide a view mode equal to rich-text and a diff markdown set to an empty string. And we can add a comma after it. I know this was quite a long setup, but now very soon you'll see how powerful of an editor this will be for both of our questions as well as the answers to those questions. But for the time being, we can test out some of the different functionalities, such as maybe creating links. But I mean, check this out. This is not really looking great. It appears right here at the bottom left, goes over the content. It's almost as this window doesn't have any styling. And that's what made me realize that this toolbar doesn't have any styling as well, because otherwise the elements would nicely appear one below another or one next to another. So let's figure out why the styles are not getting applied. We have imported the dark editor styles, but wait, weren't there another styles? If I head over to the docs, getting started, there we go. These were the styles that I was thinking about. I think we removed them back when I moved this back into the question form. And then I forgot to add the styles here as well. So let's just add the styles above our dark editor by importing the add mdx editor /editor /style.css. And there we go. This is much better. And looks like our imports are complaining a bit. So I'll move this above and we are good. It looks even better on desktop. We can have different headings. So we can say heading 1. Since I know Markdown, I can immediately create a heading 2 or a heading 3. But for people that don't know Markdown, they can also use these different elements from the toolbar to undo, redo, and do all sorts of different things. Pretty cool. Even checkboxes are supported. Of course, links now look significantly better because we are actually importing the CSS. We can create different tables. We can move those tables. I mean, it is a super, super powerful editor. But what we needed for the most is this little thing right here. Insert code block. I can say something like, hi there, I'm struggling with this error. By the way, don't start asking for help like this. Just be specific. Say what you've tried before, and then say why it didn't work and what you want to achieve. Let's say that we thought that there should be a React query icon right here. Instead, it's just giving us the default dev icon. So I can say the React query dev icon is not getting rendered. Instead, I'm getting a default dev icon. There we go. And now we can provide a block of code explaining our code so people can actually debug it. So if I head back over to where we have that utility for the icons, I think that was in the tag. So if I go into the tag card, we have the get dev icon class name where we have different icons, and then we can maybe paste this block of code just as an example. So I'll go here and I'll click this and check this out. We have a complete code editor within our Markdown editor. We can choose TypeScript React, paste it, and we get complete syntax highlighting. Isn't that cool? Also, check this out. Works on both light and dark mode with proper, consistent highlighting. As you can see, it changes immediately. Notice how this is blue right now, but if I go to dark, it turns into an orange color. I mean, it's so great to have this working properly. Can anyone help? There we go. This is a very properly written question, and people are just gonna say, hey, dummy, the React query icon doesn't exist under the dev icon library. But hey, now we can at least ask proper questions. And the last form we have to implement is the tags form. Now, why didn't I do it alongside the title, as it's quite similar? Well, actually not. This tags form will be a tiny bit more complicated. You see, in this case, we'll implement a quite common but a bit complicated system where you can input some things into an input, and then based on that input, you can generate a couple of these different badges or chips, as we can call them. So we can create multiple tags off of the same input and then display them to the user like this, and even add a little X so we can delete them afterward. So with that in mind, let's head down and let's go back to a question form. Let's go back to the bottom of the question form, and right here where we have tags, of course, we want to create a custom tag input. Or should I say a way to track the array of tags that isn't so straightforward. So as soon as someone inputs a new tag and hit enter, it should be added to some kind of an array of different tags. If they provide the same tag, it should say tag already exists. And if there are more than 3 tags, it should provide an error message. So it's basically a custom input using React hook form. So let's do that. We already have some simple input right here. And as you can see, we wrapped it in a div. That's because a Shatsian form component only allows you to have one child element. So later on, once we want to display some tags right here below the input, we have to put it in a div. In this case, our input is already looking pretty good, but I'm gonna add a special onKeyDown property that's gonna be called whenever a key press is entered, and I'll call the special handle input key down function, to which I'll pass the event and the field inside of which that event is being triggered. For now, this function doesn't exist, but we'll create it soon. And once we do, we'll be able to map over all of these tags. So let's head over above and let's create this function. That's going to be the last function needed to then finally create a question. In this case, I'll call it const handle input key down, which is going to be equal to an arrow function where we accept an event and then a field as well. First things first, we want to check if the event.key is triple equal to the enter key. In that case, we want to prevent the default. So e.prevent default. Why? Because the default behavior of the form, once we submit it or press enter, is to just reload the page. In this case, we're not quite yet ready to reload the page or submit the form. We just want to submit the tag. So once we tell the browser don't do anything yet, we have to extract the value of the tag input by saying const tag input is equal to e.currentTarget.value.trim. So we want to trim it because it can only be a single word. Also, notice how the event and the field are now complaining because of TypeScript. So let's define event as react.keyboard event, and then specifically an HTML input element keyboard event. And then the field will actually be an object that has a value, which is going to be an array of different strings. Now that we have the tag input, let's see if it exists by checking if tag input exists and if tag input dot length is lower than 15 characters. In that case, we can also check if not field dot value dot includes the tag input, which means that we want to check if the tag doesn't already exist on the tags array. If that is the case, we want to use the form to set a value on it of tags, where we're going to take all of the previous field values. So we're going to spread the field value and then append this additional tag input to the tags array. That's going to look something like this. After that, we want to simply clean up this event by saying e.currentTarget.value is equal to an empty string. And then if there were any errors with it, we can say form.clear errors, and that's going to be equal to clearing the errors of tags. Right here, it looks like our TypeScript is complaining a bit that the type string is not assignable to type never. This is quite an interesting one, so we'll have to debug it soon. But for now, let's also do some additional error handling by adding an else if, and then checking if tag input dot length is greater than 15, in which case we can use the form dot set error of tags input to type manual, and then give it a message of tag should be less than 15 characters. And we can add one more else if, and check if field.value.includes the tag input, in which case we can say tag already exists. It looks like I didn't close something properly. There we go, now it's better. And now we can use this field right here, or field.tags, to render some of the tags. So let's try doing it right away by heading over to the tags, and then trying to render the field.value.map, where we get each individual tag of a type string. And then for each one, we can map over. And for now, let's simply show a string that's going to render the tag. If we do it like that and try typing something, you'll see that we get field.value is not a function. That's because first, I would want to make sure that they even exist. So let's add a field .value.length is greater than 0, and only if it exists, then render a div. And then within that div, we can render this field value map. So let me copy it, and let me put it right here within the div. Make sure to properly close everything so we're good. And there we go. We can also give this div a class name of flex-start, margin top of 2.5, flex-wrap, and a gap of 2.5 as well. And again, Tailwind CSS IntelliSense saves me right here, where I typed flex-start. It's just going to be flex-start right here. And now if I start typing, you can see that we have field.value.map is not a function. So obviously we're not properly setting the value of the tags property. Let's see why this error is happening. Well, first of all, this TypeScript warning could be pointing us to a solution. It's saying that type string is not assignable to type never. So what if we specified its type right here, where we say use form? We can open up a new pair of code braces and then say z.infer, and then type off ask question schema, and then we can close it properly like so. This way, this form can infer the value of the tags. Also, we have some issues right here with the imports, but they got quickly fixed. So now we have no more TypeScript errors, but of course, just changing the type of something isn't gonna make this error go away. So we still have to figure out why field.value.map is not a function, or in other words, why the field.value doesn't exist. What I'll do first is I'll head into the handle input key down, and I will simply console.log the field and the event. If I do that, open up the terminal right here on the client side and type some kind of a letter here, you can see that we have some different things. We first get the field, and the field actually does contain the value, but for the time being, it is set to an empty string. And then the second thing is a click event, which actually works properly. It got a key of t, which is exactly what I typed. So now we know that a field exists, but it says that it is an empty array. But why, if I run that map, why is it throwing an error if this is indeed an empty array? Maybe at the start it's a string, so at the start it cannot map over it. And what I can do in that case is maybe add some question marks right here to make sure that it doesn't break if it doesn't need to. And I will add a new console log right here where I can just console log the field, or maybe even field that value so we can see what is inside of it. I will now type some letter here, go to the terminal, and see that we get back a letter A from question form 137, which is right here. And that means that we turn the field that value into a string instead of an array. So that leads me a bit closer to the solution. I think the fact that we're spreading the field functionalities here make it change the field in the usual way, which is just changing the string. But in this case, we're doing something special, so I will not be spreading the field, and rather we're defining how we want to handle each input key down on our own. So if I save it and reload and type a letter T or test, you can see that works. If I press enter, it actually adds it right here at the bottom. And I can remove this comma, and you can see that we have just test. If I enter something like test 1, you can see that it adds it as well. What about test 2? That's good. What if I type test again? You can see tag already exists, which means the error handling works. And what if I type anything else? It adds it. But should we not limit it at 3? Yeah, that's definitely something that we should be doing. So if I head above, you can see that right now we're allowing them to add as many as possible, but then later on, once we actually submit the question, we'll ask them to remove some of these tags from the form. So for the time being, we're okay, and we can actually properly showcase these tags instead of just rendering plain texts. And to do that, we will actually reuse the tag card we have used before. So instead of simply returning a string, we can return a self-closing tag card property coming from tags. And to it, we have to pass a couple of props. Let's pass a key equal to tag, since we're mapping over it. Let's pass an underscore ID equal to tag, a name equal to tag. Let's make it a compact version. Let's give it a possibility to remove things, meaning we can click on it to remove it. This is just a prop right now, but later on, we will actually create JSX with a button that allows us to remove that tag. I'll give it the isButton property, and I have to give it a special function, handle remove, which will be a callback function that calls the handle tag remove functionality that passes which tag to remove and from which field. So let's just create it above so our linter is not complaining. I'll create it as const handle tag remove and just leave it as an empty block for now, which should be enough to allow us to head into the tag card and modify it to accept all of these new props to achieve this new UI of the tag card. We're going to make it even better than in the design. So to do it, let me actually type something like react.js. And I mean, just check this out. Already by itself, it is looking great because we're reusing the tag card that we have created for the sidebar. So don't forget about that. Check it out right here. React.js works like a charm. But of course, we can make it even better by allowing us to remove it or to modify it somehow. So let's actually style the tag card further. I'll make it accept all of these new props, such as remove, which is going to be of a type Boolean, isButton, which is going to be of a type Boolean, and handle remove, which is going to be a function that accepts nothing and returns void. There we go. And we can now accept all of these things through props. After compact, we have remove and isButton and handle remove. Great. And now we can use them right here. Now, as you can see, currently, each one of these buttons is a link. But right here, we're creating a question. And we don't really want to navigate off of the form. I mean, just imagine if somebody typed a long question and they click on this React.js and we lead them to a tag details page of React.js. They would be mad. So for that reason, we don't want to make these links. So what I can do is something like this. I will extract what is inside of this link, like the badge and the show count and all of those things, and I'll pull it into a new variable right here, const content is equal to what we just copied. And now we can render that content right here in between the link. I'll soon explain why. And it looks like I have to wrap this into a React fragment because we have multiple children elements. There we go. So for now, nothing will actually change. We still see the same React tag. But now what this allows us to do is modify it further. So we can say something along the lines of, if compact is true, then we can return, and then if is button is true, then we'll return a button version of this component where we have a class name of flex, justify between, and a gap of 2. And within this button, we render the content like this. But if we don't want to have it as a button, then we can return this link component right here. And of course, we have to properly close it. There we go. So now if I click on it, you'll notice that it's not actually going to redirect me. But of course, we still have to make it work a bit better. And what do I mean by a bit better? Well, I'll go right here below this div inside of the badge, and I'll check if remove is true. In that case, I will render an image coming from next image with a source equal to /icons/close.svg with a width of 12, a height of 12, an alt tag of close icon, a class name of cursor dash pointer, object dash contain, invert 0, and on dark mode, invert. And of course here, we can actually pass it the on-click functionality of handle remove, because on this button click, we want to remove the tag, for which we haven't yet implemented the logic, but we'll do that soon. You can now see it here. We can also style it a bit further by giving this badge a property of flex, flex-row, a gap of 2, and save. That's going to give us some breathing room for the button. We have this show count right here at the bottom, and then we have if compact and if button or link. So now you can see how we're reusing this content we created to show it within a button or within a link. In this case, it's just going to be a delete button. So let's go back to question form, and let's actually implement the handle remove functionality, which I misspelled right here, under handle tag remove. In this case, we will have to accept a tag of a type string, as well as a field of a type string array. Within it, we can create a list of new tags, which is going to be equal to field.value.filter, where we get each t or tag, and we want to keep all of them besides the tag that we just clicked on. So if t is not equal to tag, that's going to give us all of the new tags without the one that we just clicked to delete it, which means that we can create a form.setValue of tags and make it equal to new tags right here. After that, we'll have to check if new tags dot length is equal to 0. In that case, we can form dot set error, specifically set an error on the tags field of a type manual and say tags are required. We also have an issue right here on this filter saying that property filter does not exist on array iterator of string. And that's because field within itself is actually an object that contains a value that is then of a type string array. So it's so nice that it gave us that warning. Then it gave us another warning because I misspelled value for values. If I fix it, we're actually good. And now if I click on React, you can see that it deletes it. I can give it a shot with something like JavaScript. Perfect. Let's try Redux. Oh my God, it's so nice to see these icons actually working. And I think you can finally see why I spent so much time to actually get this dev icon automatic addition based on user input to work, because we don't have a set of predefined tags. Actually, users will be able to create them. So if I go with CPP for C++, or maybe just C, you can see all of those have their own icons we can delete them, we can add them, and it's just working amazingly well. The error handling is working too. So if I type test, you can see that it gets away. I just have one issue, and that is if I click on a tag, it actually brings me back to the first question for some reason. So let's try to fix that. How would I start about fixing that? Well, if we go into our form fields where we map over them, we actually want to see what happens once we click on a tag card. Currently, each tag card is a button because in this case, we're providing it the isButton property. And it is possible that this button tries to submit the form. Because you can see, if I reload, we have no errors. But what happens if I try to click Ask a Question? It brings us to the top and says title is required. The same thing happens when I create a tag and click it. It tries to submit a form, okay? So how would we make that not happen? One solution that I can think of is maybe giving this button an on click, which is going to be something like handle click. And then we can define that handle click right here. And we can prevent the default. So we can get the event, the click event, and say e.prevent default, which would prevent the default behavior of actually trying to submit the form. And this is going to be a react.mouse event. Now if I reload and try it again, I'll type react and click it. You can see nothing happens. And now we can freely click it. And if we want to delete it, we can create another one, delete it. Now the tags are working perfectly. And with that, we're getting very close to actually test out our form in the handle create question functionality. But I've noticed some issues right here in mobile. Some horizontal scroll. That should never be happening. Even though it looks good right now, but you can see that some elements are floating outside of the view, like these inputs, text fields, and the editor. Now, I'm not sure which specific field is pushing it out. There's one specific exercise that I can do to test that out. So let me try to open up a new inspect element. Let's try to replicate what we had. They're going out, and now I can try to zap specific elements by just deleting them from the view. Like if I take the editor component, for example, this one here, and I press backspace on it, it's going to delete it. Once it does, what can you see? If I collapse it, you can see that they're no longer going out. So what have we learned from that? Well, the editor is the culprit. The editor is actually going outside. So let's head over in the components editor, and let's see if we can maybe modify it so that it doesn't jump out. I'll just reload the screen so we actually get back the editor. One thing that I tried out before was changing the display property of the editor to grid. And if you do that, you can notice that immediately now we have the top part of the grid, which is this header or the toolbar, which now scrolls horizontally. And then right here below it, we have the content. So this is working perfectly and no longer does it jump out. Great. Now let's figure out where do we get access to these values from these different inputs and editors. If I go back to the question form, I can try to console log the data that we're receiving. So let me go right here. Let me get access to the data, which is going to be of a type z.infer, type of ask question schema. And right here, let's console log the data. If I save it, I'm going to enter some kind of a title like, how do I learn to code? I'll enter some additional text like, how do I learn to code? Please help me. AI is coming for me. And I'll go ahead and add tags. I'll say AI, web dev, and JavaScript. I'll open up inspect element, expand my browser so I can better see what's happening, and click ask a question. And would you look at this? We get the title, we get the content right here, and you can see that all formatting is properly applied. We can see a couple of backward slashes and then ends for new lines, and then we can see the double asterisks for bolding. In the same way, we get the array of 3 different tags that we are ready to submit. So do you know what this means? Well, this means that now we have successfully created all of the front-end parts of this application necessary to be able to communicate over to our database. We have a form that just waits to be connected to the backend. And after that, immediately we already have a homepage that is just waiting to pull the new questions once we do create them from the backend and then display them right here. Real ones, of course, not these fake ones. So let's commit this by saying implement tag input, commit and sync, and take a well-deserved break. Or if you're really, really hyped, you can continue straight away because now we're diving into backend development. Finally, right?